The rope burns on Eliza's wrists weren't from the bindings. Those had been removed an hour ago. They were from her own hands, twisting against each other behind her back, nails digging into palms hard enough to draw blood. Anything to feel something other than the weight of 200 eyes crawling over her skin like insects. The auction platform smelled like horse piss and rotting wood. Someone had hammered it together in the pre-dawn dark, the nails still gleaming fresh where they bit through planks, scarred by years of livestock sales. Now it groaned under the weight of something far worse than cattle. Lot 710. The auctioneer's voice cut through the September morning like a rusty saw. Harold Sykes, Red Hollow's self-appointed arbiter of debts and public humiliation, stood beside the platform with his ledger open, his spectacles catching the sun in sharp little flashes. He'd known her father, had eaten at their table, had praised Margaret Crow's bread as the finest in 3 territories. That was before the fever took both her parents within a week of each other, before the creditors came like vultures, before everything Eliza thought she knew about community and dignity turned out to be written in disappearing ink. One able-bodied woman, age 24, literate, experienced in domestic work and bakery trade. Sykes read from his ledger without looking at her. Opening bid to settle the outstanding debts of the Crow estate, $300. The crowd shifted. Boots scraped dirt. Somewhere a baby cried, quickly shushed. Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the mountains beyond the town's edge, those distant peaks still wrapped in morning mist, indifferent to human cruelty. 300 seems steep for damaged goods, Harold. The voice came from Thomas Wardell, who ran the grain store and fancied himself a wit. Laughter rippled through the assembly, nervous at first, then gathering strength as others joined in. The kind of laughter that needs permission before it can show its teeth. Damaged goods. Because she'd refused his son's advances last spring. Because she'd told him where to shove his marriage proposal when he'd suggested it might solve her money problems. The Wardells had long memories and small minds. Bid stands at 300, Sykes repeated, louder now. Do I hear 250? Marcus Brennan stepped forward. Eliza's stomach turned to ice water. Brennan owned the saloon and the rooms above it, rooms where women worked off debts that somehow never seemed to shrink, no matter how many men climbed those stairs. His smile was all teeth, no warmth. Mr. Brennan's bid is $250. Going once, $275. A new voice, Edwin Cartwright, the freight company owner. His wife stood 20 feet away, face pinched tight, pretending to examine her gloves. Everyone knew Cartwright kept a woman in Silverton. Everyone knew his wife knew. The mathematics of frontier marriage played out in public silence. The bids came faster now. Men who'd nodded politely to her on the street last year now appraised her like horseflesh. Women who'd bought her mother's cinnamon rolls whispered behind their hands, eyes bright with something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite satisfaction, schadenfreude. Her mother had taught her that word, the pleasure derived from another's misfortune. German, precise, and far too accurate for comfort. 300, Brennan said, his voice flat now, done playing. Eliza's knees wanted to buckle. $300 would clear the debts, but it would also put her firmly in Brennan's pocket. She'd seen what happened to women who entered those rooms above the saloon. They came out different, something behind the eyes gone dark and quiet, if they came out at all. 300 from Mr. Brennan, going once. She could run. The thought hit her with perfect clarity. The platform had no railing on the back. 3 steps and she'd be down, maybe 5 seconds to the alley between the smithy and the dried goods store. They'd catch her eventually. Sheriff Duggan was young and mean and enjoyed the chase, but at least she'd make them work for it. At least she wouldn't just stand here like a sheep. Going twice? Her muscles tensed. Now or never. 3 steps. 5 seconds. Whatever came after couldn't be worse than the expression on Brennan's face as he calculated his investment. $500. The crowd went silent. Not the gradual hush of attention shifting, but the sudden shocked quiet of a gunshot in an enclosed space. Even the baby stopped fussing. The man who'd spoken stood at the very back of the assembly, half hidden in the shadow of the grain warehouse. Eliza had to squint against the morning sun to make him out. Tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing buckskin and fur that marked him as a mountain man. His hair was dark, pulled back, and his face carried the kind of weathering that came from years above the tree line. She'd never seen him before. She was sure of it. You didn't forget a man who looked like he'd been carved from the mountains themselves. I'm sorry. I didn't catch your name, sir. Sykes had recovered his voice, but it came out thinner than before. Rowan Vance. The man stepped forward, and the crowd parted like water. Not from courtesy, from something deeper. Primitive. The way prey animals move aside for predators not out of respect, but from the bone-deep knowledge that staying in the path means dying. Mr. Vance, Sykes's Adam's apple bobbed. Your bid is $500? Cash. Vance pulled a leather pouch from his belt and tossed it to Sykes, who caught it with both hands. The auctioneer's eyes went wide as he felt the weight, then wider still when he opened it and saw the gold coins inside. This is highly irregular. The bidding typically, you asked for bids. Vance's voice was quiet, but it carried. I bid. Anyone else? The silence stretched. Brennan's jaw worked like he wanted to speak, but something in Vance's posture, utterly still, weight-balanced, hands loose at his sides, suggested that raising the bid might raise other things as well. Cartwright had already melted back into the crowd. Even Thomas Wardell kept his mouth shut for once. Going once, Sykes's voice shook. Going twice. He looked around one last time, desperate for someone to challenge this, to restore the proper order of things. Sold to Mr. Rowan Vance for $500. The gavel came down. The sound seemed too small for what it meant. Vance walked toward the platform, each step measured and deliberate. Up close, Eliza could see the scars, a pale line across his left cheekbone, another bisecting his right eyebrow. His eyes were gray, the color of winter storms over the peaks, and when they met hers, she couldn't read anything in them. No lust, no satisfaction, no cruelty. Just a kind of careful assessment, like he was gauging the weight of a trap or the quality of a pelt. He held out his hand. For a moment, Eliza couldn't process the gesture. Her brain kept insisting it meant something else, that he was reaching for her wrist, her arm, to pull her down and drag her away like livestock. But his palm was up, open, waiting, an invitation, not a demand. Her hand moved before her mind caught up, and his fingers closed around hers, rough with calluses, warm despite the morning chill. He helped her down from the platform, steady and careful, like she was made of something breakable. Get your things, he said quietly. Whatever you want to keep. There's nothing. They took it all for the debts. Clothes? Personal items? Gone. Sold last week. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. She'd expected it to crack. He nodded once, then turned to face the crowd. No one had moved. 200 people frozen in place, watching this transaction that had gone so far off the rails they couldn't even begin to process it. Anyone got a problem? Vance asked the assembly. No one answered. Sheriff Dugan studied his boots. Brennan's hand had drifted toward his coat, where Eliza knew he kept a derringer, but hadn't committed to the draw. The mathematics of violence played out in that hesitation. A two-shot pistol against a man who looked like he'd survived things that would kill a grizzly twice over. Brennan's hand dropped. Good. Vance's fingers touched Eliza's elbow, gentle, guiding. Come on. They walked through the crowd, which parted the same way it had before. Eliza kept her spine straight, her eyes forward, even though her legs felt like water and her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack bone. The faces blurred past, some shocked, some disapproving, some lit with a kind of hungry curiosity that made her skin crawl. At the edge of the square, she saw Catherine Miller. They'd been friends once, when friendship meant sharing hair ribbons and dreams about futures that seemed possible. Catherine held her daughter on her hip, and for just a second their eyes met. Catherine looked away first. The message was clear. Whatever happened now, Eliza was on her own. The town had washed its hands of her the moment Sykes opened his ledger. What came next was her problem, her consequence, her new reality. Vance's horse stood hitched outside the grain warehouse, a massive bay gelding that looked half wild and entirely capable of murder. Next to it, a pack mule carried supplies wrapped in oilcloth and secured with rope that spoke of someone who knew how to tie knots that held. You know how to ride? Vance asked. Some. It's been a while. You'll remember. He swung up into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot, then reached down. Come on. Eliza looked at his hand, then at the horse, then back at the town square where the crowd was starting to disperse, the show over. She thought about Brennan's rooms above the saloon, about Cartwright's wife pretending not to see, about Catherine looking away. She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him like she weighed nothing, settling her on the horse's haunches. The gelding shifted under the extra weight, but didn't protest. Well-trained or well-beaten. Probably both. Hold on, Vance said. To what? Me. She hesitated, then wrapped her arms around his waist. The buckskin was rough under her palms, and she could feel the solid muscle beneath, the heat of him cutting through the morning cold. It was the closest she'd been to another human being in months, since before her mother died, since before the world fell apart. The horse moved, and Red Hollow began to fall behind them. They rode in silence for the first hour. The trail climbed steadily, leaving the valley floor and its scattered homesteads behind. Pine trees closed in on both sides, their shadows long and cool. Somewhere a creek ran, the sound of water over stones following them like a ghost. Eliza tried not to think. Thinking meant processing, and processing meant dealing with the fact that she'd just been bought by a complete stranger and was now heading into the mountains with no idea what came next. Better to focus on immediate things. The rhythm of the horse's gait, the smell of pine sap and wood smoke that clung to Vance's clothes, the ache starting to build in her thighs from riding without a proper saddle. They stopped around noon in a clearing where the trail widened enough for the pack mule to come alongside. Vance dismounted and held up his arms. Eliza slid down, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. You okay? He asked. Fine. A lie, but a necessary one. He didn't call her on it. Instead, he pulled a canteen from the mule's pack and handed it to her, then set about checking the animal's hooves with the methodical care of someone for whom neglecting such things meant dying alone in the wilderness. Eliza drank, the water cold and tasting faintly of metal. Her throat was raw, from dust, from tension, from swallowing down everything she wanted to scream. Where are we going? She finally asked. My cabin, 3 days north, up in the high country. And then what? Vance straightened, fixing her with those storm-gray eyes. Then you decide. Decide what? What you want to do. Stay, leave, head to another territory. Your choice. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. My choice? You bought me. Paid $500. That's not the kind of money a man spends without expecting something back. I bought your debt, he corrected quietly. Not you. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, you're standing here instead of in Marcus Brennan's saloon. You think there's no difference in that? The words hit like a slap. Eliza's jaw clenched, heat flooding her face, anger and shame mixing into something acidic in her chest. He was right, and she hated that he was right, hated that the truth of it was so obvious that even a stranger could wield it like a weapon. Why? She demanded. Why did you do it? You don't know me. You've never even seen me before today. Vance was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on adjusting the mule's pack straps. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful. I had a sister once, Caroline. She was 17 when the debts came. Our father died in a mine collapse, and the company said he owed them for equipment, for lodging, for things that didn't exist or he'd already paid off twice over. They don't care. Numbers in a ledger matter more than people. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite grief, but its weathered cousin, the kind that comes from old wounds that never quite healed right. They sold her to a logging camp foreman. I was 16, working a trap line 200 miles north. By the time I got word and made it back, he shook his head. Doesn't matter. Point is, I couldn't help her. But I can help you. That's reason enough. Eliza stared at him, trying to find the lie, the angle, the hidden cost. Men didn't do things for free. They didn't spend fortunes on strangers out of altruism. There had to be something else, something darker waiting to show its face once they were alone in those mountains where no one would hear her scream. But his eyes held steady, and she couldn't find the deception. I'm sorry, she said finally. About your sister. Me too. He finished with the mule and turned back to his horse. We should keep moving. Want to make the Bennett Creek ford before dark. Water's high this time of year, easier to cross in daylight. They rode on. The afternoon stretched long, the trail growing steeper and narrower. Twice they had to dismount and lead the animals through sections where loose scree made footing treacherous. Eliza's boots, the only pair she owned, worn thin at the soles, slipped on the rocks, and more than once Vance's hand shot out to steady her before she went tumbling down the mountainside. He didn't comment on it, didn't make a show of his strength or her weakness, just kept her upright and kept moving. By the time they reached Bennett Creek, the sun was painting the western peaks in shades of copper and blood. The water ran fast and loud, swollen with snowmelt from higher elevations. It looked deep enough to drown in and cold enough to stop a heart. We'll camp on this side, Vance said, surveying the crossing. Too dangerous in the dark. He set up camp with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else, choosing a spot away from the creek where the ground was level and dry, clearing stones and branches, building a fire ring from rocks. He had a small canvas tent which he erected in minutes, then turned to his packs. You know how to cook? He asked. Some. Her mother had taught her the basics, though it had been months since she'd had the luxury of ingredients worth cooking. He pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle and handed it to her. Inside was dried venison, hard biscuits, coffee beans, and a few withered apples that had seen better days. Do what you can with that. I'll see to the horses. Eliza knelt by the fire ring, arranging kindling the way her father had shown her years ago. The first spark from the flint caught, and she coaxed it into flame with careful breaths, feeding it twigs until it grew strong enough for larger wood. The venison she cut into strips and set on the flat rocks at the fire's edge to warm. The biscuits were too hard to eat straight, so she crumbled them into her tin cup with water to soften. The coffee she saved. They'd need it more in the morning. Vance returned as the meat began to sizzle, bringing the smell of horse sweat and pine resin with him. He settled on the opposite side of the fire, putting the flames between them. Deliberate distance, she realized, giving her space. They ate in silence as the darkness thickened around them. The creek sang its endless song, and somewhere an owl called, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Stars began to appear overhead, more stars than Eliza had ever seen from Red Hollow's valley floor, so many they seemed to press down like a weight. The tent's yours, Vance said when they'd finished. I'll sleep by the fire. That's not necessary. Yes, it is. She wanted to argue, but the exhaustion hit her all at once. Not just physical tiredness from the ride, but the bone-deep weariness that came from fear held at bay for too long. Her body had been running on pure survival instinct since she'd woken up on that platform, and now that the immediate danger had passed, everything was catching up. Thank you, she managed. He nodded, already spreading his bedroll by the fire. The tent was small but well made, the canvas thick enough to cut the wind that had picked up as night fell. Eliza lay on the bedroll he'd provided, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like smoke and distance, and stared at the canvas overhead. She should be terrified. She was alone in the wilderness with a strange man who'd spent $500 on her, heading toward a cabin where there would be no witnesses, no help, no escape. Every rational thought screamed danger, but he'd given her food, given her the tent, put the fire between them, given her a choice. That word kept circling back. Choice. When had she last had one? Not when her parents died, not when the creditors came, not when Sykes read her name from his ledger like she was a piece of furniture. Choice had been a luxury she couldn't afford, a fairy tale for people who had power. And now this stranger, this mountain man with scars and silence, offered it like it was the simplest thing in the world. Eliza closed her eyes and listened to the creek, to the wind in the pines, to the quiet sounds of Vance settling by the fire. Her hand found the pulse at her wrist, counting heartbeats until sleep finally pulled her under. She woke to the smell of coffee. Dawn light filtered through the canvas, gray and thin. Outside, she could hear Vance moving around the camp, the soft clink of metal on stone, the rustle of canvas being folded. When she emerged from the tent, he had everything nearly packed, the fire reduced to coals. Morning, he said, handing her a cup. We'll cross the creek after you've eaten. Should make the high pass by tomorrow evening if the weather holds. The coffee was strong enough to peel paint, bitter and hot. Eliza drank it gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. They broke camp in silence, working around each other with the awkwardness of strangers performing familiar tasks. Eliza tried to help with the packs, but her knots were clumsy and Vance had to redo half of them. He didn't comment, just fixed her mistakes and kept working. The creek crossing was exactly as terrifying as it looked. The water came up to the horse's chest, fast enough to push against them with real force. Eliza clung to Vance's waist, her eyes squeezed shut, listening to him talk to the gelding in a low, steady voice. The horse lunged forward, found footing on the far bank, and pulled them up onto dry land. The mule followed, more sure-footed than it had any right to be. "You okay?" Vance asked again. Getting tired of that question, Eliza shot back, then immediately regretted her tone. "Sorry, yes, I'm okay." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Fair enough." They climbed higher into country that seemed more vertical than horizontal. The air thinned, making her lungs work harder. Her legs ached from the constant riding. Her back protested every jolting step. But she didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't change anything except his opinion of her, and for reasons she couldn't quite name, that mattered. Around mid-morning, they stopped to water the animals at a spring that bubbled up between rocks. Vance pulled out a piece of jerky and tore it in half, offering her the larger portion. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said. "Depends on the question. Why live up here? So far from everything?" He was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. "People are complicated. Mountains aren't. They don't lie, don't change their minds, don't pretend to be something they're not. Rock is rock. Snow is snow. You know where you stand." "That sounds lonely." "Sometimes," he acknowledged. "But it's honest lonely. Not the kind you get in a room full of people who don't give a damn if you live or die." Eliza thought about Catherine looking away, about the crowd watching her humiliation like it was entertainment, about every neighbor who'd crossed the street to avoid her after her parents died. "I think I understand that," she said quietly. They reached the cabin late on the third day, just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks. It sat in a meadow carved out of the pine forest, backed up against a cliff face that provided shelter from the worst of the wind. Smoke rose from the chimney. Vance must have banked the fire before he left, and it had burned low but not out. The structure was larger than Eliza expected. Not just one room, but several, built from whole logs chinked with mud and moss. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and there were shutters on the windows that looked like they'd been fitted with actual care, not just thrown together. "This is home," Vance said, dismounting. "Not much, but it's solid." He helped her down, and this time her legs held steady. 3 days of riding had returned some of the muscle memory, or maybe she was just too stubborn to fall. Inside, the cabin was clean and spare. A main room with a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies in labeled jars. A curtained doorway led to what must be a bedroom, and another door opened onto what looked like a storage room. "You take the bedroom," Vance said, already moving to stoke the fire. "I'll sleep out here." "For how long?" He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Long as it takes." "For what?" "For you to decide what you want." That word again. Want. As if she had any idea what that meant anymore. Wanting seemed like something that happened to other people, people who had the luxury of desires beyond survival. But standing in this cabin with its warm fire and solid walls, with a man who kept his distance and his promises, Eliza felt something unfamiliar uncurl in her chest. Not happiness. That was too far, too fast. But maybe the faintest shadow of something that might someday become it. Safety. The radical notion that the next hour wouldn't be worse than this one. "I want a bath," she said. "I've wanted one for 3 days." Vance nodded, already pulling a large metal tub from its hook on the wall. "I'll heat water. Might take a while." "I've got time." And she did. For the first time in longer than she could remember, time wasn't her enemy. It was just time, passing like the creek over stones, indifferent and infinite. Eliza sat at the table and watched Vance work, filling pots, hanging them over the fire, testing the temperature with his fingers. Outside, full dark had fallen, and the wind picked up, whistling around the cabin's corners. But inside it was warm, and the fire threw dancing shadows on the log walls, and when the first pot of hot water hit the tub, steam rose like a prayer. 2 weeks passed before Eliza realized she'd stopped looking over her shoulder. It happened gradually. The constant tension in her spine easing by degrees, her sleep deepening from the fitful doze of prey to something approaching actual rest. Vance kept his word about the distance, sleeping on the main room floor even though there was a perfectly good bedroom going unused. He'd wake before dawn to tend the animals, check his trap line, chop wood, while she figured out how to navigate this strange new existence. She wasn't good at being idle. The first few days she'd tried, sitting on the porch, watching the mountains, letting herself recover from the bone-deep exhaustion of the past months. But idleness felt too much like waiting for the next disaster, and her hands needed work the way her lungs needed air. So she started with small things, sweeping the cabin floor, organizing the supplies on Vance's shelves into something resembling order, washing the few dishes they used, mending a tear in the curtain that separated the bedroom. He didn't ask her to do any of it, but he didn't stop her either, and when he came in from the cold to find his clothes patched or stew simmering on the fire, he'd nod his thanks, and that was enough. But it wasn't enough for Eliza. Not really. "Teach me," she said one morning as he was preparing to check his northern trap line. He looked up from his pack, one eyebrow raised. "Teach you what?" "How to survive out here, how to hunt, trap, track, all of it." "That's not—" "I know what you're going to say. That I don't need to, that I can just stay here and keep house, and that's fine. But it's not fine. Not for me." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I spent my whole life being useful in one way, baking bread, keeping a home, all those things women are supposed to be good at. And when that world fell apart, I had nothing else. I won't make that mistake again." Vance studied her for a long moment, and she couldn't tell if he was looking for weakness or measuring her resolve. "It's hard work," he said finally. "Cold, bloody, and most of it's boring as hell until it's terrifying. You'll get hurt. You'll fail more than you succeed, especially at first." "I know. And I'm not a patient teacher. I'm not a patient student." That almost smile flickered across his face again. "All right then, get your coat." The lessons started immediately and without ceremony. Vance led her into the forest behind the cabin and pointed at the ground. "What do you see?" Eliza looked. Pine needles, dirt, rocks. Nothing remarkable. "I don't—" "Keep looking." She crouched down, studying the earth more carefully. After a minute, she spotted it. A slight depression in the needles, the faint outline of something that might be a print. "That," she said, pointing. "What is it? A track?" "What kind?" She had no idea. The shape was partially obscured, could have been anything. "I don't know." "Then you don't know if it's something you should follow or something you should run from. Look closer." She did, tracing the outline with her eyes. 4 toes visible, claw marks beyond them. Too large for a dog. "Wolf," Vance confirmed. "Passed through about 6 hours ago, moving west. See how the edges are still crisp? Fresh enough to matter, old enough that we're not in immediate danger." He pointed to another mark nearby. "And there. Smaller print, different pattern. Pine marten, probably hunting the same game trail. They won't interact, different prey, different methods." He stood, already moving deeper into the forest. "The ground tells you everything if you learn to read it. Who's here, where they're going, how long ago they passed, weather coming in, water sources, which plants are safe to eat and which will kill you. Most people walk through the wilderness blind because they never learn to see." Over the next week, he taught her to read those signs, how to identify different tracks, judge their age, follow them without leaving obvious signs of her own passage, how to move quietly through underbrush, testing each step before committing her weight, how to use the sun and stars for navigation when the trails ran out or the weather closed in. It was harder than anything she'd ever done. Her feet, soft from years in the bakery, blistered inside her inadequate boots. She lost trails that seemed obvious to Vance, mistook deer tracks for elk, stepped on every dry branch in a 10-mile radius. Her frustration built daily, but so did something else, a fierce, stubborn determination not to quit. The trapping lessons came next, and they were worse. Vance showed her how to set snares along game trails, how to disguise deadfalls, how to check the traps without getting caught in them herself. The first time she found a rabbit in one of her snares, still warm but very dead, she had to walk away and breathe through the nausea. You don't have to do this part, Vance said quietly when she returned. Some people can't. I can. She picked up the rabbit, forcing her hand steady. Just give me a minute. He showed her how to dress it quickly, mercifully, wasting nothing. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and he talked her through each step in that quiet, matter-of-fact voice until her own hands stopped shaking and started learning. By the end of the third week, Eliza could set a decent snare, follow a trail for half a mile without losing it, and gut a rabbit without vomiting. It wasn't much, but it was progress. And more than that, it was power. The kind that didn't depend on someone else's goodwill or a world that played by rules she understood. They fell into a rhythm. Mornings meant lessons, tracking, trapping, sometimes fishing in the cold streams where you had to be faster than the current and luckier than the trout. Afternoons meant work, processing meat, tanning hides, chopping wood, maintaining the cabin and equipment. Evenings meant rest, meals shared across the table, quiet conversation that never delved too deep but wasn't entirely shallow either. Vance talked about the mountains like some people talked about religion, reverent but practical, loving the beauty but respecting the danger. He'd been living up here for 6 years, he told her, ever since Caroline died, and he'd had nothing left tying him to civilization. Don't you miss it? Eliza asked one night as they cleaned up after dinner. People, society, all of that? Which part? The part where they lie to your face, or the part where they stab you in the back? The part where you're not alone. He was quiet for a moment, drying a plate with more attention than it needed. I'm not alone now. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they should have been. Eliza felt heat climb her neck and focused very intently on scrubbing the pot in her hands. You know what I mean, she said. Yeah, I do. He set the plate on the shelf. And the answer's still no. People talk a good game about community and connection, but when it matters, when you need them most, they vanish like smoke. Or worse, they're the ones holding the knife. Up here, the dangers are honest. A rock slide doesn't pretend to be your friend first. That's a bleak way to see the world. It's an accurate way. He turned to face her. You think I'm wrong? You stood on that platform and watched your entire town. People who knew you, who ate your family's bread, who smiled at you on the street, turn you into a commodity. Tell me I'm wrong. She couldn't. The memory was too fresh, too raw. Catherine's eyes sliding away. Wardell's laughter. Brennan's calculating smile. Even Sykes, who'd eaten at their table, hadn't hesitated to raise that gavel. Not everyone's like that, she said, but it sounded weak even to her. No, Vance agreed. Just enough that trusting the wrong one can kill you. The conversation died there, both of them retreating to safer topics. But it lodged in Eliza's mind like a splinter, not painful exactly, but present, impossible to ignore. October arrived with the first real cold. Morning frost silvered the meadow grass, and the high peaks wore caps of fresh snow that crept lower each day. Vance started preparing for winter in earnest, and the pace of work intensified. We need meat, he announced one morning, enough to last through the heavy snows. That means elk, maybe 2 if we can get them. You ready to learn to shoot? The rifle was heavier than she expected, the wood worn smooth from years of use. Vance showed her how to load it, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze rather than pull the trigger. They spent an afternoon shooting at targets he'd carved into trees, and Eliza discovered she had a decent eye but terrible patience. You're anticipating the kick, Vance said after she'd missed the same target 3 times. The gun fires before you're ready because you're tensing up. Trust the weapon. Trust yourself. Easy to say, harder to do when the rifle slammed against your shoulder hard enough to leave bruises and the noise rattled through your skull like thunder. But she kept trying, kept failing, kept trying again. And slowly, grudgingly, she started hitting more than she missed. The elk hunt happened on a gray morning when the clouds sat low enough to brush the treetops. They left before dawn, moving through the forest in silence, Vance reading signs that remained invisible to Eliza's untrained eyes. Around mid-morning, he held up a hand and they stopped. He pointed. It took Eliza a full minute to spot the elk, a cow grazing at the far edge of a clearing, maybe 100 yards distant. Her heart kicked into a gallop. Can you make that shot? Vance whispered. She wanted to say no. The target seemed impossibly far, impossibly alive. But she'd been learning for weeks, and his confidence in even asking the question meant something. I can try. He nodded. Breathe, find your sight. Don't think, just do it. I know. She settled the rifle against her shoulder, finding the familiar weight. Sighted down the barrel, putting the elk in the notch. Her heart hammered, but her hands stayed steady. She thought about Red Hollow, about Brennan's rooms, about Catherine looking away. Thought about all the times someone else had controlled her fate. Not anymore. She breathed out slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked. The elk dropped. The silence that followed felt enormous. Eliza lowered the gun, her hands shaking now, staring at the fallen animal. She'd killed it. Cleanly, quickly, but dead was dead, and she'd been the one to do it. Good shot, Vance said quietly. Come on, we need to dress it before the temperature drops. The work was brutal and humbling. They bled the elk, gutted it, began the process of quartering the carcass for transport. Eliza's hands disappeared into warm blood, and the smell was overwhelming. Copper and earth and something primal that made her want to gag and weep and laugh all at once. She did none of those things. She just worked. By the time they loaded the meat onto the pack mule and started the long trek back to the cabin, the sun was setting and Eliza felt like she'd aged a decade. Every muscle ached, blood had dried on her hands and clothes, she probably smelled like death. But she'd done it, had tracked, shot, and dressed an elk that would feed them through the winter. Had proved something to Vance, but more importantly, had proved something to herself. That night, after they'd hung the meat in the smokehouse and scrubbed themselves as clean as cold water allowed, Vance pulled out a bottle from a high shelf. Whiskey, amber, and sharp-smelling. To first kills, he said, pouring them each a measure. Is that a tradition? It is now. They drank, and the whiskey burned its way down Eliza's throat, bringing tears to her eyes. But it was a good burn, the kind that reminded you that you were alive. Thank you, she said when she could breathe again, for teaching me. For all of this. Vance shook his head. Don't thank me. You did the work. But you gave me the chance to do it. That's not nothing. He looked at her across the table, firelight playing across his scarred face, and something shifted in his expression. The careful distance he maintained softened just slightly. You're welcome, he said quietly. The moment stretched, fragile and strange. Eliza felt suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth of the cabin, of the fact that they were alone here with nothing but miles of wilderness between them and anyone else. Her pulse picked up for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Vance cleared his throat and stood abruptly. I should check the fire in the smokehouse. Make sure it's still going. Right, yes, good idea. Good. He left, and Eliza sat alone in the cabin, staring at her whiskey and feeling like she'd just navigated something dangerous without quite understanding what it was. Winter closed in fast after that. The first big snow came in mid-October, dumping 2 feet overnight and transforming the world into something alien and beautiful. Eliza woke to silence, that particular muffled quiet that only fresh snow brings, and looked out to see Vance already up, clearing a path to the smokehouse. She pulled on her coat and boots and joined him, taking the second shovel without asking. They worked side by side in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath pluming white, and it felt natural, comfortable, like they'd been doing this together for years instead of weeks. The routine shifted with the season. Trap lines needed to be checked more often, trails cleared after each snowfall, firewood replenished constantly to keep the cold at bay. They were snowed in more days than not, the world reduced to the cabin, the meadow, and the close-pressing trees. Eliza thought she'd hate the confinement. Instead, she found a strange peace in it. The mountains demanded attention to immediate, practical things. Split wood or freeze, check traps or starve, maintain your shelter or die. There was no room for dwelling on the past. No energy left at the end of each day for anything but sleep. And slowly, without quite meaning to, she began to heal. It showed in small ways. The nightmares that had plagued her since her parents' deaths came less frequently. Her hands stopped shaking when she held the rifle. She caught herself humming while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, melodies she'd thought lost along with everything else. One evening in late October, a storm rolled in fierce enough to rattle the shutters and send snow horizontal past the windows. Vance came in from securing the animals, ice in his beard, and found Eliza had made stew thick with elk meat and root vegetables. "Smells good," he said, shrugging out of his coat. "It's my mother's recipe. We're close to it. Hard to remember the exact proportions." They ate, and the storm howled outside, and Eliza found herself talking, really talking, for the first time since she'd arrived. About her parents, their bakery, the before times when Red Hollow had been home instead of the site of her worst humiliation, about her father's terrible jokes and her mother's singing and all the small ordinary things that made up a life before it ended. Vance listened without interrupting, his attention complete, and when she finally ran out of words, he nodded slowly. "They sound like good people," he said. They were. Her throat tightened. "I miss them." "That's good too. Means they mattered." Simple words, but they hit like a revelation. She'd been so focused on surviving the grief that she'd forgotten that the grief itself was proof of love, evidence of something worth missing. "Tell me about Caroline," she said, "if you want to." He was quiet for so long she thought he'd refuse. Then, slowly, he began to speak. Caroline had been bright, he said, curious about everything, always asking questions that didn't have easy answers. She'd wanted to be a teacher, had saved up money from sewing work to eventually go to a proper school out east. But then their father died, and the company came with their ledgers and their lies, and all those dreams turned to ash. "I should have been there," Vance said, his voice rough. "Should have come back sooner, should have done something. By the time I found her—" He stopped, jaw clenched. The foreman said she fell, that it was an accident, but Caroline was careful, she didn't fall. Eliza's hands tightened on her cup. "What did you do?" "What I could, which wasn't enough." He met her eyes. The law didn't care. Dead logging camp worker wasn't worth investigating, especially when the foreman's brother-in-law was the sheriff. So I made my own justice. Meaning? Meaning the foreman fell too, into the river during a spring flood. Very tragic. He said it flatly, without emotion, but Eliza heard the weight beneath the words. The cost of that choice, the line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. And after? After I left. Came up here where the only lives I'm responsible for are my own and whatever animals I trap. Simpler that way. Lonelier too. Yeah. He stood, carrying their empty bowls to the wash basin. But lonely's better than failing people who depend on you. Eliza wanted to argue, but the storm chose that moment to send a particularly violent gust against the cabin, and the conversation died in the rattle of shutters and the moan of wind through the chimney. They sat by the fire until late, not talking much, just being. And when Eliza finally retreated to the bedroom, she lay awake listening to the storm and thinking about all the ways grief could reshape a person, all the ways survival required becoming someone new. November brought hunters. They appeared one afternoon without warning, 3 men on horseback, leading a pack mule, rifles visible in their saddle scabbards. Eliza spotted them first from the cabin window and immediately felt her pulse spike. Visitors meant complications, meant questions, meant the outside world intruding on this small safe space they'd carved from the wilderness. "Vance," she called, keeping her voice level. He appeared from the smokehouse, took one look at her expression, and turned to see what she'd seen. His whole posture changed, not exactly hostile, but alert in a way that reminded her of the first time she'd seen him. Dangerous. Ready. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "Like hell." He glanced at her, and she met his eyes steadily. After 2 months of learning to survive in this country, she wasn't about to hide in the cabin like a frightened child. Something flickered across his face. Might have been approval, might have been resignation. "Stay behind me then." They walked out to meet the riders, Vance's hand resting casual but not on the pistol at his belt. The lead rider raised a hand in greeting as they approached. "Afternoon," the man called. He was older, grizzled, with a beard that hadn't seen a trim in months. "Name's Coleman. We're tracking elk, wondering if you've seen any herds moving through." "Saw some 2 weeks back heading east toward the Box Canyon range," Vance replied. His voice was polite enough, but there was steel underneath. "You're on private land?" "Didn't know. No offense meant." Coleman's eyes slid to Eliza, taking her in. The men's clothes she wore now, the rifle slung across her back, her work-roughened hands. "Your wife?" "My business," Vance said flatly. "How long you planning to be in the area?" "Week, maybe 2, following the herds." One of the other riders, younger, with a nasty scar bisecting his lip, spoke up. "You got a problem with that?" "I got a problem with people who don't respect boundaries," Vance said. "There's good hunting 30 miles north and plenty of unclaimed land. I'd suggest you look there." The tension thickened. Coleman raised a placating hand. "No need for trouble. We'll move on, find our own ground." He tipped his hat to Eliza. "Ma'am?" They rode off, but Eliza noticed the way the younger one kept looking back, and she didn't like the expression on his face. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Yeah." Vance watched them until they disappeared into the trees. Probably. That night he loaded his rifle and kept it by the door. Eliza did the same with hers, and neither of them slept well. But the hunters didn't return that night or the next, and gradually the tension eased. Until a week later, when Eliza was checking the northern trap line alone and heard voices. She froze, instinct screaming at her to stay quiet. The voices came from the direction of the creek. 2 men, maybe 3, talking low. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear enough. They were trying to be quiet and failing. Eliza backed away slowly, testing each footstep before committing her weight the way Vance had taught her. When she was far enough that the voices faded, she turned and ran, as fast as the snow and terrain allowed, back toward the cabin. Vance took one look at her face and grabbed his rifle. "How many?" "At least 2, maybe 3, near the North Creek." "Show me." They moved through the forest like ghosts, Vance leading, Eliza following in his tracks. When they got close to where she'd heard the voices, he signaled her to stop and crept forward alone, using the trees for cover. He was back in 5 minutes, his face dark. "They're setting traps," he said quietly. "On my land, on my trap line, taking our game." "The hunters from before?" "Yeah, Coleman's group." His jaw clenched. "Son of a bitch knows exactly what he's doing." "What do we do?" "We?" He looked at her. "Yes, we. This is my home too now." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "All right, then we spring their traps, take anything they've caught, and make it clear this land is claimed." They spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly that. Found 6 traps, all expertly placed on the trails Eliza herself had been using. Vance sprang each one with a stick, and where they'd caught rabbits or marten, he took the animals and left clear signs that someone had been there. Footprints, scat, markers that said territory claimed, move along. "Will they listen?" Eliza asked as they headed back. "They'll listen or they'll escalate. Either way, we'll know where we stand." They escalated. 2 days later, Eliza found one of Vance's traps destroyed, not just sprung, but smashed, the mechanism bent beyond repair. A message, a challenge. Vance's face went cold when he saw it. "They want to fight." "Then let's give them one," Eliza said, surprising herself with the anger in her voice. This land, this life, she'd fought too hard for it to let some entitled hunters take it away. "You sure about this?" Vance asked. "Could get ugly." She thought about the auction platform, about Brennan's smile, about every time someone had tried to take something from her without asking. "I'm sure." They prepared carefully. Vance knew where Coleman's camp was. He'd tracked them that first day and kept tabs since. It was half a day's walk north, set up in a valley with good sightlines but poor defensive positions. They waited until midnight, when the fire would have died low and the hunters would be deep in sleep. The plan was simple: spook the horses, scatter their supplies, make enough noise and chaos that they'd pack up and leave. Not violence, just a clear message that this territory was more trouble than it was worth. But plans don't survive contact with the enemy. They reached the camp to find only one man by the fire, the young one with the scar. The others must have been out on a night hunt, which Vance hadn't anticipated. The lone hunter looked half asleep, nodding over the fire, rifle across his lap. Vance signaled for Eliza to circle around to the horses while he created a distraction. She nodded and moved, careful and quiet, using every lesson he'd taught her. She was almost to the horses when the scarred hunter stood abruptly, his head cocked like he'd heard something. His hand went to his rifle. Eliza froze, but it was too late. He'd spotted her. "Well, well," he drawled, bringing the rifle up. "The mountain man's whore. What are you doing creeping around our camp?" The word hit like a slap. Eliza's hand moved to her own rifle, but it was slung across her back. Too slow, too awkward. He'd have her dead before she could unsling it. "This is private land," she said, keeping her voice steady even as her heart tried to beat through her ribs. "You need to leave." "Or what? You'll tell your man?" He stepped closer, rifle still aimed at her chest. "Where is he anyway? Does he know you're out here? Or are you looking for some company that isn't half-savage mountain trash?" Rage flooded through her, hot and clarifying. "Call him that again," the hunter laughed. "What are you going to do about it, sweetheart? You're all alone out here, and I've got the—" The shot cracked through the night. The hunter went down hard, clutching his leg and screaming. Vance emerged from the darkness, rifle still smoking. "You talk too much." The other hunters came crashing back to camp, drawn by the shot and the screaming. Vance grabbed Eliza's arm and they ran, crashing through underbrush, hearing shouts behind them. "The horses!" Coleman's voice, bellowing orders. "Get the horses! Don't let them get away!" But Vance knew these mountains in the dark, and the hunters didn't. He led Eliza through deadfalls and creek crossings, over terrain that would break an ankle if you didn't know exactly where to step. Behind them, the pursuit faltered and fell away. They didn't stop until they reached the cabin. Only then, gasping for breath, did the reality sink in. "You shot him," Eliza said. "He was threatening you. He could die." "He won't." Leg wound, lots of blood, but nothing vital. Vance reloaded his rifle with shaking hands, the first time she'd seen them shake. "He'll live to learn a lesson about respecting boundaries. They'll come for us. Bring the law or just come themselves for revenge." "Yeah," he met her eyes in the darkness. "They probably will. And I should have thought of that before I pulled the trigger. But I saw him pointing that rifle at you and I just—" He stopped, jaw clenched. "I couldn't let that happen." Eliza's breath caught. In all the weeks she'd known him, Vance had been careful, controlled, distant. This was different. This was raw. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, then turned to secure the cabin. They barricaded the door, loaded every weapon they owned, and waited for dawn. It came gray and cold, and with it a choice that would define everything that followed. "We can run," Vance said. "Head further up into the high country, find new ground. They'll never track us that far, especially with a wounded man to care for. Or we stay. Stand our ground. Dare them to come at us on our terms." Eliza looked around the cabin, at the life they'd built here, at the meat hanging in the smokehouse and the firewood stacked against winter, and all the small victories that had brought her from that auction platform to this moment. Running meant losing it all. Staying meant risking everything. "We stay," she said. Vance studied her face, looking for doubt or fear. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded. "All right then, let's get ready for company." They spent the day preparing. Vance showed Eliza how to fortify the cabin, which sight lines needed covering, where to position themselves for best defensive advantage, how to ration ammunition and water if it turned into a siege. "You really think it'll come to that?" she asked as they stacked firewood against the walls for extra protection. "I don't know. Depends on how angry they are and how stupid they're willing to be about it." He paused. "I'm sorry. This is my fault. I dragged you into this." "No." Eliza straightened, meeting his eyes. "You gave me a choice, remember? I chose to come here. I chose to learn. I chose to fight for this. Those are my decisions, not yours to apologize for." Something fierce and bright flickered across his face. "When did you get so tough?" "I've always been tough. I just needed to remember it." The hunters came 3 days later. Eliza spotted them first, 5 riders this time, moving slow and careful up the trail. She recognized Coleman at the front, but the scarred hunter wasn't with them. Either he was recovering or watching their camp. "Here we go," Vance muttered. "Remember, let me do the talking first. If it goes bad, you know what to do." They'd practiced. Positions, firing patterns, fallback points. Eliza's hands were steady on her rifle as she took her post by the window. Coleman stopped at the edge of the meadow, well out of rifle range. Vance, he called. We need to talk. So talk, Vance shouted back from the porch. Face to face, man to man. You brought 5 men. Doesn't seem like a fair conversation. Fair's got nothing to do with it. You shot Danny. Could have killed him. He was threatening my woman with a loaded rifle. I'd say he got off light. Eliza's breath caught at my woman, but this wasn't the time to unpack that. Coleman was silent for a moment. That's your story. Danny says she was sneaking around our camp like a thief. On my land I've trapped for 6 years. You're the thieves here, Coleman, and you know it. Land ain't yours unless you got papers saying so. And up here, papers don't mean much. Neither does your word, apparently. I told you to find other ground. And I'm telling you we're staying until the hunting season ends. You got a problem with that? You can take it up with the sheriff when spring comes. Vance laughed, bitter and short. Sheriff's 6 days' ride and couldn't care less about territorial disputes in the high country. You're banking on that, which means you know you don't have a legal leg to stand on. The standoff stretched. Eliza's finger rested just outside the trigger guard, her heartbeat loud in her ears. This could go bad so fast. One wrong word, one sudden move. Finally, Coleman spoke again. Here's how this works. You pack up, clear out, and we'll call it even. Danny's leg will heal. No need for more blood. And if I say no, then we make you say yes. 5 against 2. You like those odds? I like them better than you do. Vance glanced back at Eliza, a question in his eyes. She knew what he was asking. Was she willing to die for this? For a cabin in the mountains and a life that didn't belong to anyone but themselves? She nodded once. Vance turned back to Coleman. Then I guess we've got a problem. Because I'm not leaving. This is my land, my home, and if you want it, you're going to have to come take it. The hunters shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. The air felt electric, poised on the edge of violence. Last chance, Vance. Same to you. For a long, terrible moment, Eliza thought bullets would fly. She braced for it, every muscle tensed. Then Coleman smiled, a cold, calculating expression. All right, we'll do this the hard way. He wheeled his horse. Enjoy your fortress. Winter's long up here. Let's see how tough you are when the supplies run out and the snow's 20 feet deep. They rode off, but it wasn't a retreat. It was a promise. He's going to try to starve us out, Eliza said. Yeah. Vance lowered his rifle. Which means we need to move our remaining traps, hide the smokehouse contents, and prepare for a siege that could last months. Can we make it? He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw real uncertainty in his face. I don't know, but we're going to try. They worked like demons possessed for the next week, moving supplies to hiding spots in the forest, setting false trails to confuse anyone watching the cabin, rationing everything with military precision. Vance taught Eliza how to shoot in the dark, how to move silently through the cabin without showing a silhouette against the firelight, how to sleep in shifts and stay alert even when exhaustion dragged at them. It was brutal, tense, and somehow intimate. Fighting together, preparing together, trusting each other with survival. It forged something between them that went beyond friendship or convenience. One night, sitting watch while Vance slept, Eliza found herself studying his face in the firelight. The scars, the weathered skin, the hard lines carved by years of solitude. She thought about Red Hollow, about the life she might have had if her parents had lived. Marriage to some merchant's son, probably. Babies, a house on Main Street, respectability. That life seemed like a distant dream now, belonging to someone else. The woman on that auction platform had been broken, terrified, powerless. The woman sitting here with a rifle across her lap, ready to defend her home against men who wanted to take it, that woman was someone new, someone forged in the mountains and tempered by survival. She didn't know which version was better, but she knew which one felt more alive. December came, and with it, the first signs that Coleman's siege was working. Their trap lines stopped producing. Game seemed to have vanished from the surrounding forest. Twice, Eliza found traps that had been deliberately fouled, baited and sprung, the meat left to rot. A message, a taunt. They were still okay on supplies, but the margins were getting tighter. Vance started talking about rationing the firewood, about keeping only one room heated through the worst of winter. We could make a run for it, he said one night. Head south before the heavy snows hit. Start over somewhere else. Is that what you want? He was quiet for a long time. No, but I don't want to watch you freeze or starve because of my stubbornness either. Eliza set down the shirt she'd been mending. Your stubbornness? I'm the one who said we stay, remember? You wouldn't be here if I hadn't bought you off that platform. And I'd be in Brennan's saloon if you hadn't. So let's call it even on the blame and focus on solutions. He looked at her, something shifting in his expression. How did you end up so tough? I told you. I just remembered what I already was. The words hung between them, and Eliza felt the air change, that electric charge again, but different this time. Not the promise of violence, but of something else, something that had been building for months in small looks and careful distances and trust built in the spaces between words. Vance stood abruptly. I should check the perimeter. It's midnight, in a blizzard. Still needs checking. He left before she could argue, and Eliza sat alone by the fire, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of hunters. She was falling for him. The realization hit with perfect clarity. Somewhere between learning to track and dress game, between preparing for siege and defending their home, she'd stopped seeing him as her rescuer or teacher and started seeing him as just Rowan, the man who gave her choices, who taught her strength, who shot a hunter for threatening her and then apologized for putting her in danger, who kept his distance even when the small space and long nights made it nearly impossible. The question was, what was she going to do about it? The answer came 2 nights later. A massive storm rolled in, the kind that made the previous weather look like gentle flurries. Wind strong enough to tear the shutters off if they weren't properly latched. Snow coming so thick you couldn't see 5 feet. Temperature dropping so fast that the water bucket inside the cabin started freezing over. They huddled close to the fire, wrapped in every blanket and fur they owned. The cabin's walls groaned under the assault, and drafts cut through the chinking like knives. This is bad, Vance said quietly. How bad? The kind where if the fire goes out, we don't wake up. Eliza moved closer, seeking warmth. Their shoulders touched, and Vance stiffened slightly but didn't pull away. I'm scared, she admitted. Not of dying, exactly, but of not having more time to figure things out. Figure what out? She turned to look at him, close enough now that she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes. This, us, whatever we are. His breath caught. Eliza, I know. I know all the reasons this is complicated. You paid for me, even if you meant it differently. We're trapped here, which means nothing between us can be entirely free of survival concerns. And you're probably thinking I'm confused or grateful, or I'm thinking you're the strongest person I've ever met, he interrupted quietly, and that I've been fighting myself for weeks because getting involved with you when you're still finding your feet felt wrong, like I'd be taking advantage. And now I'm realizing that maybe you know your own mind better than I'm giving you credit for. Eliza smiled. Took you long enough. I'm not good at this. People, feelings, any of it. Mountains are simpler. Mountains are lonely. Yeah. His hand found hers under the blankets. They are. They sat like that as the storm raged, holding hands like awkward teenagers, and it was simultaneously the smallest and largest thing that had happened since Eliza arrived. No grand declarations, no dramatic kiss, just 2 scarred people choosing each other in the middle of a blizzard that might kill them both. The storm broke 3 days later. They emerged from the cabin like survivors of a shipwreck, blinking in the sudden sunlight, assessing the damage. It was extensive. Part of the smokehouse roof had collapsed. The woodpile was buried under 8 feet of snow. One of the shutters had torn free and disappeared into the drifts. But they'd survived, and the cabin had held. We need to get to the trap lines, Vance said. If we caught anything before the storm, it'll be buried now. They set out together, moving through a landscape transformed into alien territory. The snow was so deep that even the trails had vanished. Vance navigated by the shape of the land, by trees and rock formations, by knowledge built over years. They found the first trap empty, the second too. But at the third, a snare set near a frozen creek, they discovered something that made Eliza's blood run cold. The trap had caught something, but it wasn't game. It was a message. carved into a piece of birch bark and tied to the snare. Spring thaw, you're out or you're dead. See. Vance's jaw clenched as he read it. They're waiting us out, probably holed up at lower elevation where the weather's not as brutal. Can we make it to spring? Maybe, if nothing else goes wrong. They both knew the odds of nothing else going wrong were approximately 0, but they also knew they weren't leaving. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Eliza's life. The cold was relentless, the work exhausting, the supplies dwindling faster than anticipated. They burned furniture for firewood when the exterior pile ran out, rationed food down to portions that left them constantly hungry, took turns on watch even though there was no one to watch for. Coleman's men wouldn't be coming back until the weather cleared. But through it all, something between her and Vance deepened. They didn't talk about it much. Words seemed unnecessary when survival required such total cooperation. But it was there in the way he made sure she ate first, in the way she saved him the warmer sleeping spot, in the small touches and careful tenderness that grew in the spaces between necessity and choice. One night in late January, with the food critically low and the cold so intense that breathing hurt, Eliza woke to find Vance gone from his bedroll. Panic spiked through her until she spotted him at the window, silhouetted against the starlight. "What's wrong?" she whispered. "Nothing. Just thinking." She joined him, wrapped in a blanket. Outside, the world was silver and black, the snow glowing under a full moon, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "About what?" "About whether I'm doing the right thing, keeping you here, fighting for this place. About whether my pride is worth your life." Eliza took his hand. "It's not your pride. It's our home. Our choice. Stop trying to make my decisions for me." He turned to her, and in the moonlight his face was softer than she'd ever seen it. "When did you get so fierce?" "When I had something worth fighting for." He kissed her then, tentative at first, then deeper when she didn't pull away. It was everything a first kiss should be, desperate and gentle, hungry and careful, full of all the things they'd been too careful to say. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Vance rested his forehead against hers. "If we survive this." "When we survive this," Eliza corrected. "When?" "I want to do this right. Court you properly. Not just survival and proximity." She smiled against his mouth. "Rowan Vance, are you asking to court me in the middle of a siege and a blizzard while we're both probably going to die of starvation before spring?" "Yeah, that about sums it up." "Then yes, absolutely yes." They kissed again, and for a moment the cold and hunger and danger faded. For a moment, they were just two people choosing each other against a world that had tried to break them both. It was enough. It had to be enough. February brought the first break in their fortunes. A week of warmer weather that allowed them to get to the lower trap lines and actually catch game. 2 rabbits and a marten. Not much, but enough to push back the specter of starvation for another few weeks. It also brought visitors of a different kind. Eliza was checking a snare near the southern boundary when she heard the horses. Her first thought was Coleman's men, and her hand went to her rifle. But as they came into view, she saw these weren't hunters. They were a family. A man, a woman, 2 children huddled on a single exhausted horse, pulling a travois loaded with meager supplies. "Please," the woman called when she saw Eliza. "We're looking for the Vance homestead. We heard there's someone up here who might—" She trailed off, taking in Eliza's appearance, armed, weathered, obviously not some delicate damsel. "You found it," Eliza said carefully. "What do you want?" The man spoke up, his voice cracking from cold or desperation or both. "We're the Hadleys. Homesteaders from down in the valley. Got burned out 3 weeks ago. Raiders from one of the mining camps. We have nothing, nowhere to go. Someone in Red Hollow said there was a man named Vance who lived up here, that he might take in refugees," Eliza finished. Her mind raced. They barely had enough food for 2 people. Adding 4 more would doom them all. But she also remembered standing on that platform, remembered the crowd turning away, remembered what it felt like when no one helped. "Wait here," she said. "I'll get Rowan." She found him at the cabin, and his face went through several expressions when she explained. Surprise, concern, calculation, and finally, something that might have been resignation. "They'll die if we turn them away," he said quietly. "We might die if we don't." "Yeah, He pulled on his coat. Come on, let's go figure out which kind of people we are. When they reached the Hadleys, the children were crying silently, the kind of quiet weeping that came from learning that making noise brought punishment. Eliza's heart cracked at the sight. Vance studied the family for a long moment, and Eliza could practically see him doing the calculations. 4 more mouths, how much food that would cost, how fast their supplies would vanish. Then he looked at Eliza, a question in his eyes. She thought about community, about the kind of world she wanted to help build, about whether survival mattered if it meant becoming the same kind of people who'd watched her suffer without intervention. We'll make it work, she said quietly. Vance nodded. All right, Hadleys. Here's the deal. We've got a rough winter ahead, not enough food, and I won't lie to you. It's going to be touch and go whether we all make it to spring. But if you're willing to work, to contribute, to be part of keeping everyone alive, we'll share what we have. The man's eyes welled with tears. Bless you. Thank you. We'll work. We'll do anything. Save the thanks until we see if this plan's suicide or sense, Vance interrupted. Come on, let's get you inside before those kids freeze. That night, the cabin was crowded and chaotic in a way it hadn't been since Eliza arrived. The Hadley children, Sarah, age 6, and James, age 4, stared at everything with huge eyes. Their mother, Margaret, cried quietly while making soup from the meager supplies. Their father, Thomas, couldn't stop thanking Vance and Eliza until Vance finally told him to shut up and make himself useful checking the chimney for blockages. It was messy and loud and completely different from the careful quiet Eliza and Vance had maintained for months. It was also, Eliza realized, exactly what they needed. Because as they worked together, stretching food, sharing tasks, figuring out sleeping arrangements, something shifted. They weren't just 2 people fighting for survival anymore. They were the beginning of something larger, a community, a chosen family. And when Coleman's men finally came back in early March, riding up that trail with threats and guns, they weren't facing 2 isolated homesteaders anymore. They were facing people who'd learned to fight for each other. But that battle was still to come. For now, in the crowded cabin with its dwindling supplies and growing hope, Eliza looked around at these people, broken, desperate, choosing to stand together, and felt something she hadn't felt since her parents died. She felt like she belonged. Spring was still months away. The hardest fighting was still ahead. But for the first time since that auction platform, Eliza Crow wasn't just surviving. She was building a life worth fighting for. The Hadleys changed everything, though not in ways Eliza had expected. Thomas turned out to be decent with repairs, spending his first week fixing the smokehouse roof and reinforcing the shutters that had survived the winter storms. Margaret had a gift for stretching meager supplies into meals that almost felt adequate, and she taught Eliza techniques her own mother had never known. How to make flour go further with ground acorns, how to render every scrap of fat into something useful. The children were harder. Sarah had nightmares that woke the entire cabin, screaming about fire and men with torches. James barely spoke at all, just clung to his mother's skirts and watched everything with those enormous, haunted eyes. Eliza found herself sitting with Sarah on the bad nights, holding the girl while she cried, telling her stories about the mountains and the stars until the terror faded enough for sleep. "You're good with her," Margaret said one morning as they worked together preparing what passed for breakfast. "You have children of your own?" "No." Eliza's hands kept moving, cutting the dried venison into portions that wouldn't satisfy anyone but might keep them alive another day. "Never had the chance." "You're young still. There's time." Eliza glanced toward the corner where Vance was teaching Thomas how to properly maintain a rifle in winter conditions. Their eyes met across the crowded cabin, and something warm moved through her chest despite the cold. "Maybe," she said quietly. Margaret followed her gaze and smiled. "He's a good man. Rough around the edges, but good underneath. You can tell by how he treats those who can't fight back. The way he was with James yesterday, so patient when the boy spilled the water bucket. That tells you everything." It did. Eliza had watched Vance with the children, seen the careful gentleness in his scarred hands when he helped James with his boots, the way he let Sarah pepper him with questions about tracking without ever showing impatience. This was a different side of him, not the dangerous mountain man who'd shot a hunter for threatening her, but someone softer, Someone who'd learned hardness as armor, not nature. The supplies ran critically low by mid-March. They were down to quarter rations, everyone moving slower, thinking slower, the constant hunger making everything harder. Vance's face had gone gaunt, sharp angles where there'd been muscle. Eliza knew she looked no better. Her clothes hung loose, and her hands shook sometimes when she tried to work. "We need to make a supply run," Vance said one evening after the children had gone to sleep. "Down to one of the lower settlements. We can't make it another month like this." "Coleman's men are still out there," Thomas pointed out. "They see you, they'll know you're desperate. Might push their advantage." "They already know we're desperate. Question is whether we die slow from starvation or take the risk." Eliza spoke up from her corner. "I'll go." 4 sets of eyes turned to her. "No," Vance said flatly. "Yes, think about it. Coleman's men know you on sight. They're watching for you." "But me? I'm just another woman traveling through. I can get into Red Hollow, buy supplies, and get out before anyone connects me to you." "Red Hollow?" Margaret's voice went sharp. "Isn't that where you were... where Vance found you?" "Yes." Eliza met her eyes steadily. "Which is exactly why they won't expect me to go back." Vance stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud in the quiet cabin. "Outside, now!" She followed him into the cold March night, where the stars burned like ice chips overhead, and their breath plumed white in the air. "This is insane," Vance said the moment the door closed. "You can't go back there. Not after what happened. They'll what? Mock me? Judge me? I've survived worse than their opinions, Rowan. We all have." She moved closer, forcing him to look at her. "We need food. Real food. Enough to get everyone through to spring. You can't go. They're watching for you. Thomas can't go. He's got a bullet scar on his face from the raiders. Too memorable. Margaret needs to stay with the kids. That leaves me. Then we all go hungry a while longer. We'll hunt more. Trap more. There's nothing left to hunt. You know that. The game's moved to lower elevation, and we can't follow without running into Coleman's men. We're out of options except this one." His jaw clenched, and she could see him working through the logic, hating every conclusion he reached. "If something happens to you, then you'll have tried everything you could, but nothing's going to happen. I'll be careful. In and out, 2 days maximum. 2 days of you in that town, surrounded by people who watched you get sold like livestock. 2 days of Brennan and Wardell and every other vulture who'll see you as prey." Eliza stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth cutting through the cold. "I'm not prey anymore. You taught me that. Those mountains, these months, they changed me. I'm not the same woman who stood on that platform." He cupped her face in his rough hands, and even through the calluses she could feel the tremor in them. "I know you're not. That's not what scares me." "Then what does?" "Losing you. Sending you into danger and not being there to..." He stopped, his breath hitching. "I can't lose someone else I care about. I won't survive it again." Her heart cracked open at the raw honesty in his voice. "You won't lose me. I promise." "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise I'll fight like hell to come back. To you, to this, to everything we're building here. That enough?" He kissed her then, hard and desperate, like he was trying to memorize the shape of her mouth. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. "Be smart. Be careful. And if anything feels wrong, you run. Don't be brave, don't be stubborn. Just run." "I will." "I mean it, Eliza. I didn't pull you off that platform just to lose you to your own courage." She smiled despite everything. "My courage is exactly why you pulled me off that platform." "Yeah." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "It is." She left before dawn, riding the gelding with enough gold sewn into her coat lining to buy supplies for 6 people through spring. Vance had wanted to give her a rifle, but she'd refused. Too conspicuous, too aggressive. Instead, she carried a small pistol tucked into her boot and a knife at her belt. Enough to defend herself if necessary, not enough to start a fight she couldn't win. The ride down from the high country took all day. Eliza watched the landscape change as she descended, the pine forests giving way to mixed growth, the snow thinning until patches of bare ground showed through. Signs of early spring that hadn't reached their elevation yet. Signs of a world that kept turning regardless of their private struggles. She reached Red Hollow just after dark, the town lights looking exactly as they had the last time she'd seen them. 4 months ago, though it felt like years, like a lifetime lived by someone else entirely. The temptation to ride straight through, to bypass the town and find supplies elsewhere, pulled at her. But elsewhere meant another day's travel, and they didn't have the time. She had to do this. Eliza tied the gelding outside the general store, which stayed open late to catch miners coming down from the hills with gold dust to spend. She pulled her hat low and her scarf high, trying to make herself anonymous, just another traveler passing through. The bell chimed when she entered, and Harold Sykes looked up from his ledger behind the counter. His eyes widened in recognition. "Miss Crow," his voice came out strangled. "I didn't expect, that is, I hadn't thought, I need supplies." Eliza kept her voice level, businesslike. "Flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, sugar if you have it. Enough for 6 people through spring." Sykes's mouth worked silently for a moment. Behind him, she could see his wife peering through the curtain that separated the store from their living quarters, her face tight with curiosity. "That's quite a lot," Sykes managed finally. "If you're looking to settle a debt, the debt's paid. You saw to that personally, as I recall." She pulled a small leather pouch from her coat and set it on the counter with a solid clink. "This is cash money. Are you selling or not?" He stared at the pouch like it might bite him, then slowly reached for it. His hands shook as he counted the gold coins inside. More than enough for what she'd requested. "I can have everything ready by morning," he said quietly. "If you want to come back, I'll wait." Eliza leaned against the counter, making it clear she wasn't leaving. Behind Sykes, his wife disappeared back behind the curtain, no doubt rushing to spread the news that Eliza Crow had returned. Letter. Eliza was done hiding. Sykes gathered the supplies with fumbling hands, and Eliza watched him work. He looked older than she remembered, more worn down. The store seemed shabbier too, the shelves less full. Hard winter for everyone, apparently. "How have you been?" Sykes asked as he measured out flour, not meeting her eyes. "Up in the mountains with Vance, I heard." "You heard right." "Is he treating you well?" The question was so absurd that Eliza almost laughed. This man who'd sold her like cattle, now concerned about her well-being? "Better than anyone in this town ever did," she said flatly. Sykes flinched. "Good." The door chimed again, and Eliza's hand moved instinctively toward her boot before she caught herself. Not a threat, just Catherine Miller, holding her daughter on her hip, stopping mid-step when she saw who was at the counter. Their eyes met. Catherine's face went through several expressions: shock, guilt, something that might have been relief. Her daughter babbled something and tugged at her mother's hair, but Catherine didn't react. "Eliza," she said finally. "Catherine." An awkward silence stretched. Sykes kept his head down, suddenly very focused on tying twine around a package of coffee. "I heard you were living up in the high country," Catherine ventured. "That it's been difficult." "It's been honest. That's more than I can say for here." Catherine flushed. "That's not fair. I couldn't what? Speak up? Stand beside me? Look me in the eye while they sold me?" Eliza's voice stayed level, but each word landed like a hammer blow. "You were my friend, Catherine, or I thought you were. I had a child to think of. A husband who'd lose his job if he crossed the wrong people. I couldn't afford to have a conscience, to remember basic human decency." Eliza shook her head. "I understand survival, Catherine. Better than you know. But don't pretend you had no choice. You chose your comfort over my dignity. Own that, at least." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I've thought about that day every week since it happened. Wished I'd done something, said something, but I was scared." "So was I. The difference is, I didn't have the luxury of letting fear win." Another customer entered, Thomas Wardell, of all people. His eyes went wide when he saw Eliza, and his hand moved toward his coat. Not a weapon, she realized, but instinct, reaching for protection that wasn't there. "Miss Crow?" His voice was careful, measured. "I didn't realize you were back in town." "Just passing through, Mr. Wardell, buying supplies. That a problem?" "No problem at all." But his eyes darted to Sykes, some silent communication passing between them. "Although I imagine some folks might be surprised to see you." "Let them be surprised." Wardell shifted his weight. "That mountain man you left with, Vance, he's still up there? Why do you care?" "Just making conversation." No, you're fishing for information to pass along to Coleman's hunters, the ones who've been harassing us all winter, stealing our traps, threatening our lives. Eliza straightened, letting her coat fall open enough that the pistol grip in her boot became visible. Not a threat, exactly, just information. Tell Coleman that if he wants our land, he's welcome to come take it, but it won't be easy, and it won't be cheap. Wardell's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Probably just coincidence that Coleman's been buying supplies here all winter. That his men know exactly where our trap lines are. That they showed up right after I was sold, when Vance would have been most vulnerable. She smiled without warmth. Small towns talk, Mr. Wardell, and I've learned to listen. She hadn't known for certain about the connection until this moment, but Wardell's reaction confirmed it. He was feeding information to Coleman, probably getting paid for it. The math was simple once you saw it. Sykes finished packaging the supplies with shaking hands. This is everything. The total is... I know what the total is. I gave you more than enough. Eliza gathered the packages. Keep the change. Consider it payment for an education in who my real enemies are. She left the store with her arms full and her head high, aware of every eye following her through the windows. Let them watch. Let them whisper. She wasn't the powerless girl they'd sold anymore. The gelding stood patient at the hitching post, and Eliza was loading the supplies into the saddlebags when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. Well, well, look who came crawling back. Marcus Brennan's voice made her skin crawl, but she didn't turn around, just kept loading supplies with steady hands. Nothing to say? Brennan moved closer. She could smell the whiskey on him, sharp and sour. I paid good money for you. Would have treated you right, too. Better than some savage mountain man. You paid for a debt, not a person, and you lost. Move on. His hand grabbed her arm, spinning her around. Eliza's hand went to her boot, but Brennan was faster, or drunker, and meaner, which amounted to the same thing. He shoved her against the horse hard enough that the gelding snorted and sidestepped. You don't talk to me like that. You're nothing. A debtor's daughter who should be grateful anyone wanted you at all. Eliza's knee came up fast and brutal, catching Brennan squarely between the legs. He went down gasping, and she pulled the pistol from her boot in one smooth motion, cocking it as she leveled it at his head. Touch me again and I'll kill you. Her voice came out flat and cold. Not a threat, a promise. People had gathered now, drawn by the commotion. Eliza saw their faces in the lamplight, shocked, scandalized, some secretly pleased. Catherine stood in the doorway of the general store, one hand over her mouth. Sykes had come out too, looking like he wanted to intervene but couldn't decide which side to take. Sheriff Dugan pushed through the crowd, young and mean and exactly as Eliza remembered. Put the gun down, Miss Crow. Not until he gets away from my horse. You can't pull a weapon on people in the middle of town. He assaulted me first, multiple witnesses. Eliza didn't lower the pistol. I defended myself. That legal enough for you, Sheriff? Dugan's jaw worked, clearly caught between law and politics. Brennan owned half the buildings in town. Eliza owned nothing, except she did own something now. She owned herself, her skills, her hard-won strength. And she'd be damned if she let that go without a fight. Brennan, get up and go home, Dugan said finally. You're drunk. She assaulted me. After you grabbed her, I saw that much. Dugan turned to Eliza. And you, put the gun away and get out of town. Tonight. I don't want to see you here again. Gladly. Eliza lowered the pistol but didn't holster it. This town's not worth the air it wastes. She finished loading the supplies while Brennan limped away, cursing. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, disappointed that there'd been no more bloodshed. Dugan stayed until she'd mounted the gelding, his hand resting on his own pistol. Vance teach you to shoot like that? He asked. Among other things. He's making trouble for a lot of people, claiming land that's not legally his. Coleman's got lawyers in Denver looking into it. Could be Vance finds himself on the wrong side of the law soon. Eliza smiled down at him from horseback. Let them try. We've survived worse than lawyers. She rode out of Red Hollow at a gallop, her heart pounding and her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She'd just pulled a gun on one of the town's most powerful men in front of witnesses, had threatened him, humiliated him. There would be consequences. But as the town lights faded behind her and the darkness of the mountain road swallowed her, Eliza felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Pride. She'd gone back to the place of her greatest shame and walked out on her own terms. Had faced down the people who'd failed her and refused to be diminished. Whatever came next, she'd proven something to herself. She was done being a victim. The ride back took longer than the descent, the trail steep and treacherous in the darkness. Eliza had to dismount and lead the gelding through the worst sections, feeling her way more than seeing, trusting the horse's instincts when her own failed. By the time she reached the cabin, dawn was breaking and she was so exhausted she could barely stand. Vance must have been watching for her. He appeared on the porch before she'd even dismounted, his face haggard with worry. "You're late. You said 2 days. I had some complications." Eliza slid from the saddle and nearly fell. Vance caught her, holding her steady. "Got the supplies, though." "Forget the supplies." "Are you hurt?" "No, just tired." She leaned into him, letting him take her weight. "And I may have pulled a gun on Marcus Brennan in the middle of Main Street." Vance went very still. "You what?" "He grabbed me. I defended myself." She pulled back enough to see his face. "The whole town saw. By now the whole territory probably knows. I'm sorry if I made things worse." "Worse?" Vance's laugh came out rough, almost strangled. "You went into the lion's den, faced down everything that happened to you there, and came back with food and your pride intact. That's not worse. That's—" He stopped, his voice cracking. "That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." Thomas emerged from the cabin to help unload the supplies, and Margaret was right behind him, exclaiming over the abundance. The children woke and came tumbling out, their faces lighting up at the sight of real sugar, real flour. But Eliza couldn't take her eyes off Vance. He was looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. Not the woman he'd saved, not the student he'd taught, but someone equal, someone who'd proven herself in the only court that mattered. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "after you've rested, about what comes next." "What do you mean?" "I mean that stunt in Red Hollow. Just put a target on both our backs. Brennan won't let that slide. And if Dugan's talking about lawyers in Denver, that means Coleman's playing a longer game than we thought." His hand found hers, squeezing tight. "We can't just survive anymore. We need to fight back." Eliza nodded, too tired to process the full implications, but understanding the core truth. The siege wasn't over. It was just changing shape. She slept for 12 hours straight, crashing into unconsciousness like a stone into deep water. When she woke, the cabin was quiet and the light through the window said late afternoon. Someone had left bread and jerky within reach, along with a cup of cold coffee. She ate mechanically, her mind already churning through what Vance had said. Fight back. But how? She found him outside, splitting wood with mechanical precision. The children played nearby, building something elaborate with sticks and snow. Thomas was working on the smokehouse, and Margaret was at the creek, washing clothes in water that had to be freezing. "You're up," Vance said, setting down the axe. "How do you feel?" "Like I rode down a mountain, threatened a man, and rode back up in one piece." She watched his hands, steady, capable, scarred. "You said we need to fight back." "I've been thinking about that." And I think you're right, that we can't just defend anymore. But we're 6 people in a cabin against Coleman's money and Brennan's influence, and a whole town that's either hostile or indifferent. We need allies. Allies where? Everyone down there either wants us gone or doesn't care enough to help. Not everyone. Eliza thought about the other homesteaders she'd seen signs of during her months in the mountains. Smoke from distant chimneys, trails that intersected theirs, trap lines that respected boundaries. There are others up here, people living like we are, working land they don't legally own, trying to build something real. If Coleman can take our land, he can take theirs too. They just don't know they're at risk yet. Vance was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You want to organize them, build a coalition." "I want to give them the choice to stand together or fall separately. Same choice you gave me." She moved closer. "We can't do this alone, Rowan, but we might be able to do it together. It's risky. Bringing in outsiders, trusting people we don't know, everything's risky. Staying here is risky. Running is risky. At least this way we're moving forward instead of just holding on." He studied her face for a long moment, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Weighing options, measuring risks, trying to find the path that didn't end in everyone dead. All right, he said finally. We'll try it your way, but carefully. We approach people one at a time, feel them out, don't commit to anything until we know who we can trust. Agreed. They spent the next week making careful reconnaissance. Vance knew where most of the isolated homesteads were, having encountered their inhabitants over the years through occasional trading or simple proximity. There was the Peterson family to the northwest, Swedish immigrants who ran a small logging operation. The Chen brothers to the east, who'd come from California after the railroad jobs dried up. A widow named Ruth Callahan who trapped her own lines and took no nonsense from anyone. A handful of others, loners mostly, people who'd chosen the mountains for the same reasons Vance had. The first approach was to the Peterson family. Eliza and Vance rode out together, leaving the Hadleys to watch the cabin. The trail took them through country that showed signs of spring's approach. Ice breaking up on the streams, patches of bare ground expanding, the first brave wildflowers pushing through the snow. The Peterson cabin sat in a cleared valley with neat stacks of logs awaiting the sawmill they were building. Gunnar Peterson met them at the property line, rifle in hand but not raised. Vance. His accent was thick, but his English clear. Long time. Who's this? Eliza Crow. Vance hesitated, and Eliza felt a flutter of amusement at watching him search for the right word. My partner. Partner. Gunnar's weathered face creased into a smile. Good. A man alone gets strange. You here to trade? To talk about a problem that affects all of us. They spent 2 hours at the Peterson table, eating dense rye bread and drinking coffee that could strip paint, while Vance explained about Coleman's claim on the land. Gunnar listened without interrupting, his wife Ingrid translating for their eldest son who hadn't mastered English yet. This Coleman, Gunnar said finally. He comes here, he finds bullets. I fight Prussians in the old country. I can fight claim jumpers. Fighting isn't enough if the law's on his side, Eliza said. We need to make our own claims legal, file papers, establish boundaries, show continuous habitation. That takes money and coordination. Ingrid spoke up, her English more hesitant than her husband's. You want we join together? Pool resources? We want you to have the choice. Stand alone and Coleman picks us off one by one. Stand together and we might be able to fight him in court instead of with bullets. Gunnar and Ingrid exchanged a long look, that wordless communication of couples who'd been through hardship together. Finally, Gunnar nodded. We stand together, but if it comes to bullets anyway, we fight together too. They visited the Chen brothers next, who were initially suspicious until Vance mentioned the legal threat. The brothers had fled persecution in California, where violence against Chinese workers had driven many into the mountains. The idea of losing their hard-won sanctuary to another powerful white man with lawyers made their decision easy. We help, the older brother Wei said simply. What do you need? Ruth Callahan was harder. She lived alone in a cabin that made Vance's look like a mansion, subsisting on trapped game and an iron will that had kept her alive through 3 husbands and 30 years in the mountains. I don't trust groups, she said flatly, sitting on her porch with a rifle across her knees. And I don't trust men who come talking about standing together. Usually means they want something. We do want something, Eliza said. We want to keep our homes, same as you want to keep yours. Coleman's not going to stop at our boundaries. He's looking at this whole range as potential mining territory. Let him look. I've got bullets for claim jumpers. And he's got lawyers and money and the territorial government in his pocket. Eliza leaned forward. You can't shoot a land grant, Mrs. Callahan. You can't trap a legal writ. We need to fight him on his own ground, which means filing claims of our own and defending them in court. Ruth's eyes narrowed. You're that girl from Red Hollow, the one who got sold. Yes. And you came back here? Into the mountains with this one? She jerked her chin at Vance. I did. Why? Because it was the only place I could become who I needed to be. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, studying Eliza like she was checking a trap for flaws. Then she spat into the dirt. All right, I'm in. But if this turns into some man trying to tell me what to do with my land, I'm out. Clear? Clear. By the end of March, they'd assembled a coalition of 7 homesteads, 23 people total, ranging from the Hadley children to Ruth Callahan, who had to be pushing 60 but could still outshoot most of the men. They met at Vance's cabin on the first warm day of spring, crowding into the main room and spilling onto the porch. Eliza stood at the front, feeling the weight of their attention. These people had agreed to trust her, to follow her plan. If she failed, they all lost everything. "Thank you for coming," she began. "I know it wasn't easy, leaving your homesteads, taking the risk of being seen together. But what we're facing is bigger than any of us alone." She laid out what she knew about Coleman's operation, the money behind it, the Denver lawyers, the territorial connections. Showed them the documents Vance had collected over the winter, proving Coleman's men had been harassing multiple homesteads, stealing from trap lines, destroying property. "He wants us gone," she said, "and he's betting we'll leave rather than fight because we can't afford lawyers, can't navigate the legal system, can't organize fast enough to matter. He's betting we're too isolated, too poor, too scared." "So what do we do?" Thomas Hadley asked. "We pool our resources. Everyone here pays what they can into a common fund. We use that money to hire a lawyer in Denver, a real one, who can file our claims properly and defend them. We establish clear boundaries, document continuous habitation, and build a legal case that's strong enough to stand up in court." "And if that doesn't work?" Gunnar asked. Vance spoke up from his position by the door. "Then we defend our homes by whatever means necessary. But we try the legal route first because bullets are expensive and coffins are permanent." The vote was unanimous. By the time the meeting ended, they'd collected almost $400 in gold and silver, fortunes for people who lived at subsistence level, but barely enough to retain a lawyer for a complex land claim case. It would have to do. "I'll take it to Denver," Vance said as they counted the money that night. "Find a lawyer, file the papers. We'll take it," Eliza corrected. "Together." He looked at her and she could see the argument forming. Denver meant civilization, crowds, questions. It meant exposing her to another town full of strangers and potential danger. "Don't," she said before he could speak. "Don't try to protect me from this. I started it. I'm seeing it through." "You started it because you're brave and smart and you see possibilities I miss. But Denver's different from Red Hollow. It's bigger, meaner, and if Coleman's got connections there, then we'll deal with it, like we've dealt with everything else." The journey to Denver took 6 days. They left the Hadleys in charge of the cabin with strict instructions to send someone for help if Coleman's men showed up. Ruth Callahan had promised to check on them daily, and the Chen brothers agreed to keep watch on the northern approaches. The trail down from the high country was treacherous with spring melt, streams running high and fast, snowpack unstable, whole sections of path washed away. They had to detour twice, adding an extra day to the trip. But gradually, the mountains gave way to foothills, and the foothills to the rolling plains where Denver sat like a promise or a threat, depending on your perspective. Eliza had never seen a real city before. Red Hollow had maybe 300 people on a good day. Denver had thousands, crowding the streets, filling the buildings, creating a noise and smell that was overwhelming. Smoke from coal fires, horse manure, cooking food, unwashed bodies, all of it mixing into something that made her want to cover her nose. "Stay close," Vance murmured as they led their horses through the crowded streets. "And keep your hand away from that pistol. Law's different here." They found a boarding house that looked relatively clean and paid for a week's lodging. The landlady, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Kovach, looked them over with sharp eyes. "You married?" she asked bluntly. "Yes," Vance said before Eliza could answer. "Let's see the ring then." Vance pulled a thin gold band from his pocket. Where it had come from, Eliza had no idea, and slipped it onto her finger. It was too large, probably had been his mother's, but it gleamed convincingly in the lamplight. Mrs. Kovach sniffed, but accepted it. "Room's upstairs, third door on the left. No cooking, no guests after dark, and I don't want to hear any noise. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said, fighting the urge to laugh at the absurdity. She'd survived a winter siege in the mountains, faced down armed men, pulled a gun on Marcus Brennan. And now she was being lectured about noise by a Denver landlady. Their room was small but clean, with a real bed and a window that overlooked the street. Vance set their bags down and turned to her, looking uncomfortable. "About the ring? It's fine. She wasn't going to let unmarried people share a room, and we can't afford separate lodging. It's not just about the room." He took her hand, looking at the ring on her finger. "I should have asked properly. Should have done this right, not just lied to a landlady. Eliza's heart kicked into a higher rhythm. Rowan, what are you saying? I'm saying that when this is over, when we've fought Coleman and filed the claims and built something that can't be taken away, I want to do this for real. Marry you properly, if you'll have me. Not because of convenience or propriety, but because I can't imagine going through any of this without you. She should have been surprised, should have needed time to think, to process. But looking at this scarred, difficult man who'd given her back her life and her strength, the answer was obvious. Yes, she said simply. His eyes widened. Just like that? Just like that. We can figure out the details later, if we survive the next few weeks. But yes, Rowan Vance. When this is over, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and for a moment the noise of Denver faded, and there was just the two of them, choosing each other against everything that tried to keep them apart. Finding a lawyer proved harder than expected. The first three they approached took one look at their worn clothes and minimal funds and turned them away without even hearing their case. The fourth listened for 5 minutes before quoting a fee that would have taken their entire coalition's savings, and then some. You're claim jumpers, he said flatly. Squatters on unclaimed land. No court in the territory will side with you over a man like Victor Hale. Victor Hale? Eliza's stomach dropped. I thought we were fighting Coleman. Coleman works for Hale. Hale Consolidated Mining. You must have heard of them. They own half the silver claims in Colorado, and they're expanding into other minerals. The land you're on sits over a potential copper deposit. Hale wants it, and what Hale wants, he gets. They left that office in stunned silence. Victor Hale wasn't just some territorial magnate. He was one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in Colorado. Fighting Coleman had seemed daunting. Fighting Hale seemed suicidal. We're outmatched, Vance said quietly as they walked through the crowded streets. We can't win this. Maybe not, but we can try. Eliza's mind was racing, sorting through options. That lawyer said no court would side with us, but he didn't say our claims would be illegal. If we file properly, establish habitation and improvement, we might not win, but we could make it expensive enough for Hale that he decides we're not worth the fight. That's a long shot. Everything's been a long shot since you pulled me off that platform. We're still here. They found their lawyer on the 5th day, in the most unlikely place. Eliza had stopped in a bookshop, drawn by the window display of law texts and territorial statutes. She was browsing the shelves when a young man approached her. Researching something specific? He asked. Eliza turned to find someone barely older than herself, with ink-stained fingers and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Land claims, homesteading law, territorial jurisdiction. She hesitated, then decided to risk honesty. We're trying to file claims on land in the high country, having trouble finding representation. Because the land's already claimed by someone with more money? How did you know? He smiled wryly. Because that's the only reason people like you come into bookshops looking at law texts. People like me, too, for that matter. I'm Daniel Hirsch, recent law school graduate, currently unemployed because I made the mistake of taking a case against a railroad company on behalf of some displaced farmers. Did you win? We settled. The farmers got enough to start over somewhere else. I got blacklisted by every major firm in Denver. He pulled a book from the shelf, flipping through it. But I passed the bar, and I know homesteading law inside out. If you're willing to take a chance on someone with more idealism than experience, I'm willing to take your case. Eliza looked at him, young, earnest, clearly broke if his frayed cuffs were any indication. Everything about this screamed bad idea, except that he was here, in a bookshop, still studying law even after being blacklisted, still believing the system could work for people without power. Our opponent is Victor Hale, she said. Hale Consolidated Mining. If you take this case, you'll probably make more enemies. Daniel's smile widened. Good. I was getting bored anyway. They spent 3 days with Daniel, going over every detail of their situation. He was sharp and thorough, catching implications they'd missed, finding angles in the law that might help. The claims he drafted were meticulous, documenting every homestead's improvements, establishing timelines of habitation, citing territorial statutes that protected settlers who made the land productive. It's not perfect, he admitted as he filed the paperwork. Hale's lawyers will challenge every word, but you've got legitimate claims under the Homestead Act, and more importantly, you've got each other. 7 homesteads standing together carries more weight than 7 separate claims. What are our actual chances? Vance asked. Daniel didn't sugarcoat it. In court? Maybe 30%. But if we make enough noise, draw enough attention to the case, Hale might decide it's easier to buy you out than fight a prolonged legal battle. Public opinion matters, especially when there's an election coming up. There's an election? Territorial governor, next fall. The incumbent's already taking heat for being too cozy with mining interests. A story about hardworking homesteaders being pushed off their land by a robber baron? That's the kind of thing newspapers love. The kind of thing that could hurt his re-election chances if he's seen as taking Hale's side. Eliza felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but its cautious cousin. We can use that. Make it a political problem instead of just a legal one. Exactly. Daniel gathered his papers. I'll file these tomorrow. After that, we wait for Hale's response and start building public support. You have any connections to newspapers? Not yet, but we will. They left Denver a week after arriving, riding back toward the mountains with legal claims filed and a lawyer who believed in their cause. It wasn't much, but it was something. The ride back felt different from the journey down. Lighter somehow, despite knowing that the real fight was just beginning. They'd taken the first step from defending to attacking, from pure survival to actually building something. You know this probably won't work, Vance said on the third day, as they climbed back into the high country. Hale's got too much money, too much power. Daniel's smart, but he's one lawyer against an empire. I know. And you're still okay with this? Eliza looked at the mountains rising around them, harsh, beautiful, honest in their danger. I'm okay with fighting. Win or lose, we're fighting for something that matters. That's more than most people get. They reached the cabin on the 7th day to find the Hadleys safe but tense. Coleman's men had been spotted twice, watching from a distance. Nothing aggressive yet, but the message was clear. They knew the homesteaders had left, knew they'd gone somewhere. The siege was tightening. Let them watch, Eliza said as they unpacked the supplies. We've got legal claims now. We've got a lawyer. We're not just squatters anymore, we're litigants. That changes things. Does it? Thomas asked. Because from where I'm standing, we're still 7 families against a mining empire. Yes, but now the empire has to explain itself in court, has to justify why they deserve land that we've worked and improved, has to do it all in public, where people can watch and judge. Eliza smiled. We might lose, probably will, but we're going to make them earn it. That night, sitting around the fire with the Hadleys asleep and the mountains quiet outside, Vance pulled her close. You've changed, he said quietly, from when I first saw you on that platform. You're not just surviving anymore. No, I'm fighting. There's a difference. What made you want to fight instead of just survive? Eliza thought about that, about the long winter, the siege, the trip to Denver, about every moment that had brought her from powerless to powerful. You did, she said finally. You gave me the choice. Everything else followed from that. He kissed her temple, his arms tight around her. Then we fight together. Whatever comes. Whatever comes, she agreed. Outside, the spring night was alive with sounds, streams running high, ice breaking up, the world waking from winter's grip. Change was coming, whether they were ready or not. But for the first time since that auction platform, Eliza felt ready to meet it head-on. The response from Hale's lawyers arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by a courier who looked nervous just being in the mountains. The packet was thick, official, wrapped in legal language designed to intimidate. Daniel had warned them it would come, but seeing it in person made Eliza's stomach clench. 20 pages, Vance said, flipping through the documents. Most of its threats dressed up as legal argument. They're claiming we have no right to file homestead claims because Hale holds a territorial mineral rights grant that supersedes individual land ownership. Can they do that? Thomas asked. The other homesteaders had gathered at Vance's cabin again, cramming into the space to hear the news together. They can try. Eliza was reading over Vance's shoulder, parsing the dense legal prose. But Daniel said mineral rights don't automatically nullify surface claims. We've got until June to respond with our counter-argument. Wei Chen spoke up from the corner. June is 2 months. What happens if we don't respond? Then the court assumes we've abandoned our claims and Hale wins by default. Ruth Callahan spat into the fire. So we respond. What's the problem? The problem, Vance said quietly, is that responding means escalating. Right now, this is paper and lawyers. Once we formally contest Hale's claim, he'll push harder. Maybe not with lawyers. The room went quiet. Everyone understood what he meant. Men like Hale didn't get rich by playing fair, and when legal pressure didn't work, other kinds of pressure followed. We knew this would get worse before it got better, Eliza said. The question is whether we're still willing to fight. Everyone gets a vote. No judgment either way. The vote was unanimous again, but Eliza could see the fear underneath the determination. These were families with children, with everything they owned invested in homesteads that might be taken by force. Brave was easy when you had nothing left to lose. Harder when you'd built something worth protecting. They sent their response to Daniel along with detailed documentation of every improvement made to each homestead. Fences built, cabins raised, land cleared, crops planted. The kind of evidence that proved they weren't just squatters, but genuine settlers making the wilderness productive. While they waited for the next legal volley, life continued with the strange duality of normalcy and tension. Spring came in earnest, the meadows exploding with wildflowers, streams running clear and cold. Eliza helped Margaret plant a garden behind the cabin, turning soil that had been frozen solid months before. Sarah and James played in the sunshine, their laughter a reminder of what they were fighting for. But at night, they took turns on watch. And nobody rode the trap lines alone anymore. The first real trouble came in mid-May, when Gunnar Peterson rode up to the cabin with blood on his shirt and murder in his eyes. They burned my mill, he said without preamble. Came in the night, 3 men. Set fire to the whole operation. 6 months of work, gone. Vance's face went hard. Anyone hurt? Ingrid got the children out. I shot at them. Hit one, I think, but they got away. Left this. He tossed a piece of paper on the table. Eliza unfolded it. The message was short and clear. Leave or burn with it next time. We go to the law, Thomas said. Show them this. Make them do something. The law's 6 days away and doesn't care, Ruth cut him off. And even if they did, what are they going to do? These were hired men, probably from out of territory. No proof connecting them to Hale. So we do nothing? Gunnar's accent thickened with anger. Let them burn us out one by one? No. Eliza was already thinking, her mind sorting through options. We make this public. Daniel said newspapers matter. Well, here's a story. Mining magnate burns out family sawmill to clear squatters from land he wants. That's the kind of thing that makes people angry. And if the newspapers don't care either? Then we make them care. We go to Denver. We camp on their doorsteps. We make enough noise that ignoring us becomes harder than covering the story. Vance looked at her with something between admiration and concern. That's dangerous. Puts you right in Hale's sight. I'm already in his sight. We all are. She stood, addressing the room. They're trying to scare us into running. Standard intimidation. Destroy property. Threaten violence. Make staying more painful than leaving. It only works if we let it. If we scatter, we lose everything. If we stand together and make this visible, we force Hale to either back down or escalate in ways that might cost him more than the land is worth. You're talking about using ourselves as bait, Wei said quietly. I'm talking about refusing to be silent victims. There's a difference. The plan came together over the next week. Eliza and Vance would return to Denver with Gunnar, taking photographs of the burned mill and sworn testimony about the attack. They'd meet with Daniel, who would help them approach newspapers with the story. Meanwhile, the other homesteaders would fortify their positions and maintain constant communication through a system of signal fires they'd established. If anything happens, you light the fire, Vance told Thomas before they left. We'll see it from the high ridge and come running. And if you don't come back, then you make the choice that's right for your family. No shame in leaving if it means keeping Margaret and the children safe. Thomas's jaw clenched. We didn't run from raiders in the valley. We're not running from Hale's thugs either. The ride to Denver was tense and fast. Gunnar pushed hard, his fury at the mill's destruction driving him forward. They made the journey in 5 days instead of 6, arriving exhausted and filthy, but carrying documentation that couldn't be ignored. Daniel's face went pale when he saw the photographs, stark images of charred timber and ash where the mill had stood. This is assault, arson, possibly attempted murder if Hale's men knew the family was inside. We need to go to the territorial marshal. Will he care? Eliza asked. He'll have to. This crosses a line even Hale can't buy his way past. Daniel gathered the evidence. But we also need public pressure. Let me set up meetings with newspapers. The Rocky Mountain News has been critical of mining interests lately. They might run with this. The news ran the story on the front page 3 days later. The headline screamed, "Mining Empire Burns Family Homestead," above a detailed account of the attack and the larger land dispute. The photographs of Gunner's burned mill were impossible to ignore, and the article painted a clear picture: powerful corporation versus hard-working settlers. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Some letters to the editor supported the homesteaders, calling Hale a robber baron and demanding justice. Others argued that squatters had no legal rights and should be cleared off valuable mining land. The territorial governor's office issued a bland statement about investigating the incident while respecting property rights, which meant they'd do nothing unless forced to. It's not enough, Eliza said, reading the governor's response in Daniel's office. The story got attention but not action. We need more pressure. What did you have in mind? She thought about that auction platform, about standing in public humiliation while a crowd watched, about how visibility could be power if you controlled the narrative. A demonstration. We bring all the homesteaders to Denver, stage a public gathering, make it impossible for the governor to ignore us. Daniel frowned. That's risky. Leaves your homesteads undefended, puts everyone in one place where Hale's men could what? Attack us in the middle of Denver with witnesses everywhere? That would be even better for our case. Eliza leaned forward. We're fighting a legal battle, but law follows politics. We need to make this politically expensive for everyone protecting Hale. She's right, Vance said quietly. He'd been silent through most of the meeting, but now he spoke with conviction. Hiding in the mountains means we can be picked off quietly. Making noise in the city means people have to choose sides publicly. They organized the demonstration for the first week of June, coordinating through messages carried by riders between homesteads. 23 people would leave their land, a huge risk, to gather outside the territorial courthouse and demand action. The night before they were set to leave Denver and return to the mountains to organize everyone, Eliza couldn't sleep. She stood at the boarding house window, watching the city's gas lamps flickering in the darkness. Vance came up behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. Second thoughts? 1,000 of them. What if this backfires? What if Hale uses everyone being gone to destroy the homesteads? What if the demonstration turns violent and someone gets hurt? Then we deal with it, same as we've dealt with everything else. I keep thinking about Sarah and James. They've already been burned out once. If this goes wrong, it's still better than doing nothing. You taught me that. He turned her to face him. That girl on the auction platform could have kept her head down, accepted whatever happened. She chose to fight instead. Everyone following you now is making the same choice. Following me? Eliza shook her head. I'm not a leader. I'm just someone who's too stubborn to quit. That's exactly what a leader is. Someone who won't quit when everyone else wants to. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solidity. I'm scared, Rowan. Really scared. Not of dying, but of being wrong. Of getting people hurt because I pushed too hard. Fear means you're taking it seriously. Means you care about the people depending on you. His arms tightened around her. And for what it's worth, I don't think you're wrong. Hale's counting on us being too afraid or too divided to resist. Proving him wrong is the only chance we've got. They returned to the mountains to find the homesteads intact, but the tension ratcheted higher. Coleman's men had been seen daily now, no longer trying to hide their surveillance. The message was clear. We're watching, we're waiting, and we're not leaving. Let them watch, Ruth said when they gathered to finalize plans for the demonstration. They'll see us leave for Denver and think we've abandoned our claims. Then they'll see us come back even stronger. The journey to Denver with 23 people, including children, was logistically nightmarish. They traveled in a loose caravan, the pace dictated by the youngest members. It took 8 days instead of the usual 6, and by the time they reached the city, Everyone was exhausted and filthy and scared. But they were together. Daniel had arranged for them to stay in a church basement. The pastor was sympathetic to their cause and willing to risk Hale's anger. It wasn't comfortable, but it was free and relatively safe. They spent the first night simply recovering, feeding the children, trying to explain to Sarah why they'd left the cabin again. The demonstration was scheduled for noon the next day outside the territorial courthouse. Daniel had alerted newspapers, sent formal notice to the governor's office, and even arranged for a photographer to document the event. Remember, he told them that morning, this is peaceful. No weapons, no threats, no violence even if provoked. We're here to petition our government for redress, which is a legal right. The moment we turn violent, we lose public support. They gathered in the courthouse square just before noon. 7 families, worn and weathered, but standing tall. Eliza had helped everyone prepare signs the night before, simple messages painted on scrap wood. Homesteaders, not squatters. Hale burns families. Protect settlers, not corporations. A crowd gathered quickly, drawn by curiosity. Some faces were sympathetic, others hostile. Eliza saw several well-dressed men who had the look of mining company employees, probably sent to monitor the situation. Daniel stepped forward to speak, his voice carrying across the square. We're here today representing 7 homesteading families from the high country. Families who've worked hard to build lives on land they've improved and occupied legally. Families who are now being threatened, harassed, and attacked by agents of Hale Consolidated Mining, which wants to clear them off land they claim through territorial mineral rights grants. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Squatters got no rights!" "We're not squatters," Gunner called back, his accent thick but his voice firm. "We build, we plant, we make land productive. That is law. Homestead Act says so." More voices rose, arguing for both sides. The photographer's flash powder went off, capturing the scene. Eliza held her sign steady, Sarah pressed against her side, and tried not to think about how exposed they all were. Then she saw him. Victor Hale himself, emerging from a carriage across the square. She recognized him from newspaper sketches. Tall, well-dressed, silver hair perfectly groomed. He was flanked by men who were clearly lawyers, and he moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life. He walked straight toward their group, and the crowd parted for him. Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself between Hale and the homesteaders. "Mr. Hale, I'm Daniel Hirsch, legal counsel for—" "I know who you are." Hale's voice was cultured, Eastern educated. "And I know what you're attempting here. Public theater designed to pressure the territorial government into ruling against legitimate mining interests. We're attempting to protect our legal homestead claims from illegal harassment and violence." "Harassment?" Hale's eyebrows rose. "My company has done nothing illegal. If certain individuals have chosen to leave land they were illegally occupying, that's their decision." "Your men burned my mill!" Gunner pushed forward, and Vance had to grab his arm to hold him back. "You think we don't know who sent them?" "I think you have no proof of any such connection." Hale's eyes swept over the assembled homesteaders, dismissive and cold. "I think you're desperate people making desperate accusations because you know your claims have no legal merit." Eliza felt rage building in her chest, hot and clarifying. This man, this wealthy, powerful man, was standing here denying everything while looking at them like they were insects, like their suffering and fear meant nothing measured against his profits. She stepped forward and Vance tried to grab her arm, but she was already moving. "You're right that we're desperate," she said, her voice cutting through the crowd noise. "Desperate to keep homes we built with our own hands. Desperate to protect children who've already been burned out once. But you're wrong about our claims having no merit. We've filed legal homestead applications, documented our improvements, proven continuous habitation. The only question is whether the law protects people who work the land or corporations that want to strip it for profit." Hale looked at her properly for the first time, and she saw calculation in his eyes. Measuring, assessing, looking for weakness. "You must be the Crow girl, the one who was auctioned off in Red Hollow." His smile was cruel. "I heard about that. Heard you ended up with a mountain man who paid far too much for damaged goods. And now you think you can challenge me? You think a group of squatters and a failed lawyer can stand against Hale Consolidated?" The crowd had gone silent, everyone straining to hear. Eliza felt the weight of their attention, felt Sarah's small hand clutching her skirt, felt Vance tense beside her, ready to intervene. She smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. I think power looks impressive until someone refuses to be impressed. I think money buys a lot of things, but it doesn't buy the moral high ground. And I think you're afraid. Afraid? Hale's voice went sharp. Of you? Of what we represent. 7 families who won't break, won't run, won't disappear quietly so you can take what you want without consequences. You could have bought us out months ago, offered fair prices for our land, negotiated like decent people do. Instead, you tried intimidation and violence because you assumed we'd be easy to remove. We're not. And now every day this drags on, every newspaper story, every public demonstration costs you more than just buying us out would have. That's what scares you. Not us specifically, but the precedent. If we win, other people might think they can stand up to you too. The crowd murmured. Hale's jaw clenched, and for just a moment Eliza saw something dangerous flash across his face. You have no idea what you're risking, he said quietly, meant for her ears only. I've crushed bigger obstacles than you. Smarter people, with more resources, with actual legal standing. What makes you think you're different? Because I've got nothing left to lose. You already took everything once. I won't let it happen again. They stared at each other, and Eliza refused to look away first, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her blink. Finally, Hale turned to his lawyers. File an emergency injunction. I want these people barred from returning to their so-called homesteads pending resolution of the mineral rights question. If they're not on the land, they can't claim continuous habitation. Daniel stepped forward. You can't do that. They have legal residency. We'll let the court decide what they have. In the meantime, they can stay here in Denver and watch their claims dissolve. Hale tipped his hat mockingly to Eliza. Enjoy your demonstration, Miss Crow. I hope the publicity was worth losing everything. He left, his entourage following like a wake behind a ship. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with conversation. The photographer had captured everything, his flash powder going off repeatedly. Did that just happen? Margaret asked quietly. Did he just threaten to bar us from our own land? He can try, Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. The legal basis is shaky at best, but if he gets the right judge, then we fight it in court, same as everything else. Eliza turned to the group, seeing fear and exhaustion on every face. Listen to me. Hale just showed us something important. He's rattled. People with all the power don't bother threatening nobodies. They just crush them. The fact that he came here personally, that he's filing emergency injunctions, means we're actually hurting him, making this costly enough that he's trying new tactics. Or he's about to destroy us completely, Thomas said. Maybe, but we knew that was possible going in. The question is still the same. Do we quit or do we fight? Ruth spat on the ground. I didn't ride 8 days to Denver just to quit because some rich bastard got his feelings hurt. We fight. The others murmured agreement, but Eliza could see the doubt underneath. They were scared, outmatched, and a long way from home. Courage had carried them this far, but courage wore thin when faced with the reality of Hale's power. That night, back in the church basement, Vance found her sitting outside on the steps. You did good today, he said, settling beside her. I made things worse, provoked Hale when we should have stayed quiet. You told the truth. Sometimes that's more important than being strategic. Even if it costs us everything? Vance was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars barely visible through Denver's smoke and light. My whole life, I watched powerful people take what they wanted from those who couldn't fight back. Watched them destroy my family, kill my sister, and face zero consequences because the law protected money more than people. I could have fought them then, should have, but I was young and scared and convinced I'd lose. You avenged Caroline. I killed one foreman. The company that worked her to death is still operating, still crushing people. I took revenge, but I didn't change anything. He turned to look at her. What you're doing is different. You're not just fighting back, you're trying to change the system. Make it so people like Hale can't do this to others. That's bigger than revenge. That's actually trying to build something better. And if we fail? Then we fail trying to build something better instead of just surviving something worse. I'll take that over hiding in the mountains any day. Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder, drawing comfort from his presence. When did you get so philosophical? When I met a woman too stubborn to know when she's beaten, it's contagious. She smiled despite everything. We're probably going to lose, you know. Hale's too powerful, too connected. Even if we win in court, he'll find other ways to force us out. Probably. But maybe we make enough noise that the next group of homesteaders has an easier time. Maybe we set a precedent that makes corporations think twice. Maybe we just prove that people without power can still make powerful people work for what they take. Any of those would be worth it. They sat in silence for a while, watching Denver's nightlife move around them. Drunks stumbling between saloons, businessmen heading home, the endless churn of a city that didn't care about their struggle. But somewhere in those streets, a photographer was developing images of their demonstration. A newspaper editor was setting type for tomorrow's story. People were talking about Hale confronting homesteaders, about burned mills and threatened families. Small ripples, maybe. But ripples could grow. The injunction came through 3 days later. A territorial judge, one known to be friendly with mining interests, ruled that pending resolution of the mineral rights dispute, the homesteaders were temporarily barred from occupying the land in question. They had 1 week to retrieve essential belongings, then had to vacate until the court made a final determination. This is insane, Daniel said, reading the order. They can't just evict people from legal homesteads based on an unproven mineral rights claim. They just did, Eliza said flatly. What's our recourse? Appeal to a higher court, but that takes time, and meanwhile the order stands. How much time? Months, maybe longer. The homesteaders took the news about as well as expected. Several families immediately began talking about leaving, not just the disputed land, but the territory entirely. The fight had become too expensive, too dangerous, and now they couldn't even stay on their own property while the legal battle played out. We can't afford to house everyone in Denver for months, Thomas said. We're almost out of money, and there's no work here that'll pay enough to support this many people. So we split up, Way suggested. Some go to other settlements, some stay to handle legal matters. Regroup when court makes decision. If we scatter, Hale wins even if the court eventually rules in our favor, Eliza argued. He'll claim we abandoned the claims, showed we weren't serious about homesteading. We have to stay together. On what money? With what food? We've got children to feed, Eliza. Principals don't fill bellies. She didn't have an answer. The mathematics were brutal and simple. They couldn't afford to stay in Denver, couldn't legally return to their land, and couldn't abandon their claims without losing everything. They were trapped. That night, Eliza lay awake in the church basement, listening to children whimper in their sleep and adults whisper about impossible choices. Everything she'd pushed for, all the public demonstrations and legal filings and brave stands, had led them here. Homeless, broke, and running out of options. Maybe Vance had been right from the start. Maybe hiding in the mountains and defending what they had was smarter than trying to change a system designed to crush people like them. She must have fallen asleep eventually because she woke to raised voices outside. Dawn light filtered through the high windows, and most people were still sleeping. But Vance was gone, and the voices were getting louder. Eliza grabbed her coat and went outside to find Vance and Daniel in heated conversation with a man she didn't recognize. Well-dressed, middle-aged, with the bearing of someone important. Telling you it's not enough, the stranger was saying. Hale's already got 3 judges in his pocket. Unless you've got something bigger than public sympathy, you're going to lose. Who is this? Eliza asked. The man turned, assessing her with sharp eyes. Robert Kellerman. I work for the territorial governor's office. Or did, until yesterday when I resigned rather than help cover up Hale's latest mess. What mess? Kellerman pulled a folder from his satchel. 2 years ago, Hale Consolidated filed a mineral rights grant application for a massive section of the high country. The application was approved despite several irregularities because Hale made generous contributions to the governor's re-election campaign. One of those irregularities was failing to properly survey the land in question. The boundaries described in the grant don't match the actual geography. Daniel grabbed the folder, reading quickly. This means the mineral rights grant might not even cover the homesteader's land? It means the grant is potentially fraudulent, which would invalidate Hale's entire claim. But proving it requires a full survey, which costs money and time you don't have. Why are you telling us this? Eliza asked. If you worked for the governor, why turn against Hale? Because I'm tired of watching powerful men break laws without consequences while regular people get crushed for minor infractions. And because my daughter is Sarah's age. He glanced toward the church basement where the children slept. I can't stop Hale from destroying you, but I can at least give you ammunition to fight back. Vance studied him carefully. What do you get out of this? Nothing, or everything, depending on how you look at it. If you manage to expose the fraud, the governor goes down along with Hale. That clears the way for someone who might actually enforce laws equally. That's worth the risk to me. They spent the rest of the day going through Kellerman's documents with Daniel, who got more excited with each page. The evidence wasn't conclusive on its own, but it opened new legal avenues. They could challenge the validity of the mineral rights grant, which would undermine Hale's entire case. We need a surveyor, Daniel said. Someone credible who can document the actual boundaries and prove they don't match the grant application. That will take weeks and cost... He stopped, calculating. More than you have. Then we find the money, Eliza said. We go public with this. If Hale committed fraud to get that grant, newspapers will care. People will care. Maybe enough to fund the survey. They released the story 2 days later, and the reaction was explosive. The territorial governor's office denied everything, calling Kellerman a disgruntled former employee. Hale's lawyers threatened to sue for libel. But the documents were public record now, and other newspapers picked up the story. Questions were raised in the territorial legislature. Calls for investigation echoed from multiple sources, and donations started trickling in. Not a flood. Small amounts from people who'd read the stories and wanted to help. $5 here, $10 there. A shopkeeper in Denver sent $20 with a note. My father lost his land to a railroad company 20 years ago. Make these bastards pay for once. Within a week, they had enough to hire a surveyor. Within 2 weeks, the surveyor had preliminary findings that supported Kellerman's allegations. The boundaries in Hale's mineral rights grant were so poorly described that they covered land hundreds of miles from the homesteads, a clear indication of fraudulent application. This changes everything, Daniel said, spreading the survey maps across his desk. If we can prove Hale knowingly filed a fraudulent grant, it invalidates his claim and potentially opens him up to criminal prosecution. Can we prove he knew? Vance asked. That's the hard part. Hale will claim it was an honest error by surveyors he hired. We'd need someone from inside his organization willing to testify that the fraud was intentional. The answer came from an unexpected source 2 days later, when a young man appeared at the church basement asking for Eliza Crow. My name's Jacob Miller, he said nervously. I worked for Hale Consolidated as a surveying assistant. I was there when they filed that grant application, and I can testify that they knew the boundaries were wrong because I told them myself. Eliza stared at him. Why would you do that? Testify against your employer? Because what they're doing is wrong, and because my mother is Catherine Miller from Red Hollow. She told me about what happened to you on that auction platform, about how she didn't speak up, didn't help, and it's haunted her ever since. He swallowed hard. I can't fix what she did, but I can speak up now. Maybe that counts for something. The pieces fell into place faster after that. Jacob's testimony provided the direct evidence of fraud they needed. Daniel filed an emergency motion to lift the eviction injunction and invalidate Hale's mineral rights grant. The territorial attorney general, facing mounting pressure and an election year, opened a formal investigation into the grant application process. And Hale's lawyers started talking about settlement. They're offering to buy your claims, Daniel explained at a meeting with all the homesteaders. Fair market value plus compensation for improvements. You'd have to leave the land, but you'd have enough money to start over somewhere else. How much? Thomas asked. Daniel named a figure that made several people gasp. It was more money than most of them would see in a lifetime. Enough to buy better land in safer territory, to set up businesses, to secure their children's futures. It's a good offer, Gunnar admitted reluctantly. More than we'd get fighting this out in court. It's shut-up money, Ruth said bluntly. Hale knows we've got him cornered, so he's trying to make the problem go away before we expose the whole rotten system. Can we refuse? Margaret asked quietly. I mean legally. Can we turn down the settlement and keep pushing? You can, Daniel confirmed. But the criminal investigation moves forward regardless of whether you settle. If you refuse the offer, you're gambling that you'll win in court and get to keep your land. If you accept, you walk away with money, but give up the homesteads. The room fell silent. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The choice between certainty and principle, between safety and the chance at something better. Eliza looked around at the faces she'd come to know so well over the past months. These weren't her family by blood, but they'd become family through shared struggle. Whatever they decided, she'd support it. "I think we should vote," she said. "Everyone gets a say, even the children old enough to understand what's at stake. This affects all of us equally." The vote took an hour. Some people wanted to accept immediately. The money was too good to pass up, and they were exhausted from fighting. Others refused on principle. Taking Hale's money felt like letting him win. The children mostly wanted to go home, back to the mountains and the lives they'd been building. When the count finished, the decision was split almost evenly. 11 people wanted to accept the settlement. 12 wanted to keep fighting. "One vote difference," Wei said quietly. "That's not enough to decide something this important." "Then we table it," Vance suggested. "Tell Hale's lawyers we need more time to consider. Use that time to make sure everyone's really thought through what both options mean." They spent the next week in agonizing discussion. Daniel laid out best-case and worst-case scenarios for both choices. Kellerman visited again, providing more information about the criminal investigation. Jacob Miller's testimony was corroborated by other former Hale employees coming forward, building a case that looked increasingly solid. But solid wasn't certain, and certainty was what people needed when they had children depending on them. In the end, it was Sarah who tipped the balance. "I want to go home," she told Eliza one evening. "Not to Red Hollow, not to Denver. Home to our cabin. To the garden we planted and the chickens and the place where the mountains come right down to the meadow. That's our home now. We shouldn't have to leave it just because some mean man wants it." Eliza carried those words to the next meeting, and something shifted. The conversation stopped being about money versus principle and started being about what kind of world they wanted to build for children like Sarah, what kind of precedent they wanted to set. The second vote was taken on a warm June evening with all the windows open and a breeze carrying the scent of prairie grass into the church basement. This time, it was unanimous. They would refuse the settlement and fight for their land. Daniel delivered their decision the next morning, and Hale's lawyers were furious. They threatened, they blustered, they warned about the consequences of turning down such a generous offer. "Our clients have made their choice," Daniel said calmly. "They're choosing to defend their legal homestead claims in court. We'll see you at trial." The trial was set for late July. The judge, a different one this time, brought in from another district to avoid bias concerns, lifted the eviction injunction pending the trial's outcome. The homesteaders were free to return to their land. They left Denver on a morning that felt like victory, even though nothing was truly won yet. 23 people, tired and scared but united, heading back to the mountains that had become home. Eliza rode beside Vance at the front of the group, watching the plains give way to foothills and the foothills to mountains. Somewhere up there, her cabin waited. The garden she'd planted, the improvements they'd made, the life they'd been building. "You did it," Vance said quietly. "Brought everyone together, kept them fighting even when it seemed hopeless." "We did it, all of us." "No, you were the catalyst. The rest of us would have scattered or fought alone and lost. You showed us there was another way. The fight's not over yet. We could still lose everything. Maybe, but we'll lose it on our feet instead of our knees. That's worth something." They reached the homesteads to find them intact but clearly watched. Evidence of Coleman's men everywhere, disturbed trap lines, broken fences, signs that people had been through their belongings. But nothing burned, nothing destroyed. Just a reminder that the siege continued. "They were waiting for us to stay gone," Thomas said, surveying the damage to his cabin. "Probably figured we'd taken the settlement." "Let them figure wrong," Ruth said, already repairing her fence line. "We've got 6 weeks until trial. Let's make sure this land looks so well tended and improved that no judge could possibly rule against us." They threw themselves into work with renewed purpose. Gardens were expanded, fences rebuilt stronger than before, cabins repaired and improved. The children helped where they could, their laughter returning now that they were home. Even with the constant awareness of being watched, life started to feel almost normal. Eliza and Vance fell into their old rhythms, checking trap lines together, maintaining the cabin, preparing for whatever came next. But there was a new element now. a deeper partnership forged through everything they'd been through. One evening, sitting on the porch, watching sunset paint the peaks gold and crimson, Vance pulled out the ring he'd given her in Denver. "I know we said we'd do this proper after the fight was done," he said. "But the fight's never really done, is it? There's always something else, some new battle. So maybe we stop waiting for perfect and just choose each other now, in the middle of the mess." Eliza looked at the ring, at his scarred hands holding it, at his face showing vulnerability he usually kept buried. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking you to marry me. For real this time, not just for the landlady's benefit. I'm asking you to be my partner in all of this. The fighting, the building, whatever comes next. I'm asking if you'll take me, knowing I'm difficult and damaged and probably always will be." She took the ring and slid it onto her finger, where it fit better this time. Or maybe she'd just grown into it. "Yes, on one condition." "What's that?" "You stop calling yourself damaged. You're scarred, same as me, same as all of us. But scars just mean we survived something that tried to kill us. They don't make us less. They make us proof that breaking doesn't mean staying broken." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled at the rising moon. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent, but the cabin glowed with lamplight and the smell of bread baking, Margaret teaching Ingrid her techniques, and children's voices drifted from where they played in the last light. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and uncertain, and the trial loomed like a storm on the horizon, but it was theirs, built by choice and defended through struggle, and that made it precious beyond measure. Whatever the court decided in 6 weeks, they'd already won something more important than land. They'd won themselves. The wedding happened 3 weeks before the trial, on a July morning when wildflowers covered the meadow. They debated waiting, but Eliza insisted otherwise. "If we lose everything in 3 weeks, I want to lose it as your wife," she told Rowan. Ruth Callahan officiated because she'd done it before and remembered most of the words. Eliza wore simple blue cotton. Rowan looked uncomfortable without buckskin, but his eyes made up for everything. "You sure about this?" he asked, while Ruth fumbled for her notes. Little late for second thoughts. "After the trial, if we win, there'll be more fights. It won't ever be easy. Nothing worth having is easy. You taught me that." Ruth found her notes. "All right, let's get this done. Rowan Vance, do you take this woman to stand beside her through whatever hell comes next?" "I do." Eliza Crow, same question. "You taking this stubborn mountain man even knowing he'll probably get you killed defending some principle?" "I do." "Then I declare you married. Kiss her before I change my mind about the whole institution." The celebration was modest but joyful. For one evening, the trial didn't matter. They'd chosen each other, publicly and permanently, with witnesses who'd fought beside them. As people drifted home, Eliza and Rowan stood watching stars emerge. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I'm happy and terrified and angry we can't just have this without everything else. We could still run, take everyone, head to Oregon, start over." "You don't mean that." "No, but the option exists." He pulled her close. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, this was worth it. Finding you, building this, standing up instead of hiding. We're not losing." "Eliza." "No, I'm done with backup plans. We fight, we win, we build something permanent." They spent their wedding night in the cabin they'd defended together, and morning brought news that shattered their peace. Thomas arrived at dawn, pale. Coleman's got men surrounding the Peterson place. At least a dozen, armed, not attacking, just waiting. Rowan was dressed and armed in seconds. "Stay here with Margaret and the children." "No," Eliza said, pulling on boots. "We all go. Show them we stand together." They gathered everyone who could fight and rode to find Coleman's men camped at the property line. Fires built, tents erected, guards posted. A show of force designed to intimidate without technically breaking laws. Gunner stood on his porch with his rifle. They came at dawn. Say they're protecting Hale's interest pending trial. Won't leave, won't attack. Just watching. Coleman stepped forward, hands away from weapons. "No need for alarm. We're maintaining presence on disputed land, as is our employer's right." "The injunction was lifted," Eliza said. "We have legal right to be here. Your lawyer might disagree with our interpretation, but that's for courts to decide. We'll be here until they do." The marshal was 8 days away and wouldn't care. Coleman knew it. "This is harassment," Daniel said, having ridden up from Denver. "I'm documenting everything for our court filings." "Document away, counselor. We're not breaking any laws." Technically true. They weren't on Peterson property, just surrounding it. Weren't threatening, just maintaining armed presence. "We should leave," Rowan said quietly. "This is what they want, for us to lose our tempers and do something stupid." It took everything Eliza had to ride away. Behind her, Sarah cried, asking why bad men were at their friend's house. Armed camps appeared at 2 more homesteads over the next week. Coleman's men settling in, watching everything, making normal life impossible. The psychological pressure was immense. "They're trying to break us before trial," Way said. "Make us so miserable we'll take any settlement. Or provoke violence they can use against us," Daniel added. "The judge will look poorly on homesteaders who attacked Hale's employees." "So we endure it and document everything," Eliza said. "Build a record of harassment." The strain showed on everyone. Eliza slept in shifts with Rowan, one always watching. Her hands developed a permanent tremor. The children stopped talking, just stared at the camps with frightened eyes. "This is destroying them," Eliza told Rowan, watching Sarah sleep fitfully. "You think leaving would be better? Teaching them running is the answer?" "I think there's a difference between strategic retreat and traumatizing children. Those children will grow up knowing they stood up to a bully. That matters." The trial began on a Thursday in late July. The courthouse was packed, reporters, politicians, spectators drawn by the story. Hale sat with 4 lawyers in expensive suits. The homesteaders crowded at the defendant's table with Daniel, wearing their best clothes that still looked shabby. Judge Whitmore was severe-looking, brought in specifically because he had no mining connections. That was good. The fact he looked like he'd never smiled was concerning. Hale's lawyers went first with practiced precision. Maps, surveys, documents, all showing Hale held legitimate mineral rights. The homesteaders were squatters trying to use public sympathy to override legitimate claims. "The law is clear," the lead attorney said. "Mineral rights grants supersede surface claims when properly filed. My client followed every requirement. The defendants did not." Daniel's cross-examination picked apart the survey data, showing discrepancies between the grant application and actual geography. By the end of the second day, jurors looked confused. The turning point came day 3 when Jacob Miller testified. He looked terrified as he was sworn in. Hale stared at him with promised consequences. "State your name and occupation," Daniel prompted. "Jacob Miller. I was a surveying assistant for Hale Consolidated until 3 weeks ago." "Why did you leave?" "Because I couldn't be part of the fraud anymore." The courtroom erupted. Hale's lawyers objected furiously. But Jacob had said it. He walked them through everything, surveying the actual land, reporting discrepancies to supervisors, being told to keep quiet. "Did you speak directly to Mr. Hale about these discrepancies?" "Once. At a company meeting, I raised concerns, Mr. Hale said the territories were full of incompetent officials who couldn't read maps anyway, and we should file the paperwork as written because no one would check carefully." "Objection! Hearsay and defamation." "Direct testimony from someone present," Daniel countered. Judge Whitmore allowed it. The damage was done. The homesteaders testified next, each telling their story. Gunner's Mill, Way's cleared land, Thomas and Margaret fleeing violence. Ruth was most effective. "I've been on that land 30 years, she said flatly. "Buried 2 husbands up there. Don't tell me I got no right to be there." "But you never filed formal homestead claims until this dispute, because nobody cared until Hale decided he wanted it. We're only squatters when someone rich wants to take what we built." The jury clearly sympathized, but sympathy wasn't law. Daniel's closing was everything they'd built toward. "The law says you can't claim property through fraud. The evidence shows Mr. Hale's mineral rights grant is based on false information he knew was false. My clients aren't asking for special treatment. They're asking for equal protection under law. That's not a popularity contest. That's justice." The jury deliberated 2 days. When they returned, Eliza's heart hammered as the foreman stood. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find?" The pause felt eternal. "We find in favor of the defendants." The courtroom exploded. Eliza couldn't breathe, couldn't process it. They'd won. "Furthermore," the foreman continued, We find that Hale Consolidated's mineral rights grant was obtained through fraudulent means and should be invalidated. We recommend criminal investigation. More chaos. Hale's lawyers called for immediate appeal. The governor looked like he wanted to disappear. Judge Whitmore brought order. The court finds in favor of defendants and validates their homestead claims. Hale Consolidated is ordered to remove all personnel immediately and pay court costs. He brought the gavel down with finality. Outside, reporters swarmed them. One from the Rocky Mountain News pushed through. "Mrs. Vance, you were sold less than a year ago. Now you've defeated one of the most powerful men in Colorado. What would you say to others facing similar situations?" Eliza thought about that platform, about powerlessness and the choice to fight. "I'd say rock bottom isn't the end. It's a beginning if you choose to make it one. That power looks absolute until someone refuses to be crushed. And when people with nothing left to lose decide to fight together, they can move mountains." "Literally, in your case," the reporter quipped. "Literally," Eliza agreed. "We moved a whole mining empire." The celebration that night was everything, loud, raucous, uninhibited. But underneath, Eliza felt something building. The trial was over, but the larger fight wasn't. She found Daniel in a quiet corner. "This isn't over, is it?" "The trial's over. You won." "That's not what I mean. Hale will appeal. And there'll be other Hales. We need to keep fighting, not just defending, but changing the system." "How?" "We use this victory to help others. Your practice. What if it's specialized in cases like ours? We just won compensation for court costs. What if we invested it in funding cases that can't fund themselves?" "You'd put your victory money into helping strangers?" "Why not? We won because people stood with us. Now we do the same for others." They talked late into the night, sketching plans. A legal practice focused on representing people against corporate abuse. A network that could support each other. Maybe even legislation making fraud harder to commit. Big dreams for people who'd started fighting just to survive. The legal fight dragged on for months. Hale appealed, filed motions, deployed every delaying tactic. But the core victory stood. Claims validated, grant invalidated, criminal investigation underway. The homesteaders returned to their land in late summer, finding Coleman's camps abandoned. Life began approaching normal. Gardens harvested, game trapped, children playing without constant fear. The territorial elections brought vindication. The governor who'd protected Hale lost badly. The new attorney general pursued criminal charges that resulted in heavy fines and restrictions on Hale's operations. Not enough punishment, but enough to prove consequences existed. Red Hollow reached out in December. A letter from Harold Sykes apologizing for the auction. The town had taken a hard look at itself. Brennan had been run out. The corrupt banker removed. Her father's bakery sat empty. If she wanted to reclaim it, they'd support her. "What do you think?" she asked Rowan. "I think people feel guilty when those they wronged succeed. Whether that guilt means anything depends on what they do with it." She reclaimed the bakery, but on her terms, hiring Thomas and Margaret to run it, turning it into something that served the community while funding Daniel's legal practice. The grand reopening happened in March. Slowly, carefully, it became a community hub again. Not the same, but something new built on ruins. Caroline and Michael had their first child that year, a daughter they named Margaret. Watching Eliza hold her granddaughter, Margaret started crying. "You made it. Through everything. You survived and built a life, and now there's another generation. That's victory." And maybe it was. Not dramatic triumph, but this, continuity, family, going on. Progress continued in fits and starts. 2 steps forward, 1 back, sometimes reversed. But the overall trajectory bent toward justice, even slowly. When people asked what she'd learned, Eliza's answer was always the same. That powerlessness is a choice. That systems only seem unchangeable until people change them. That justice is a direction you move in, not a destination you reach. And that ordinary people doing extraordinary things together can literally reshape the world. Years later, Red Hollow erected a statue in Crow Square where the auction platform had stood. The inscription read, "She stood on this spot at her lowest moment and chose to rise. What will you choose?" But the real memorial wasn't bronze. It was the communities built on principles she'd helped establish. The people who fought because her story showed it was possible. The slow progress toward a world where auction platforms were relics. That was the legacy that mattered. Not a statue, but proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to quit. When they understood rock bottom was just another place to build a foundation. When they chose to fight. But peace never lasted, and Eliza learned that victory brought its own complications. 3 years after Caroline's 5th birthday, a charismatic newcomer named Vernon Cross arrived with followers and ambitions that threatened everything they'd built. Cross positioned himself as a leader within weeks, proposing formal structures that would centralize power under his control. He was smooth, persuasive, and dangerous in ways Hale had never been, because he came from within, speaking the language of community while building his own empire. "Something's wrong with him," Rowan said after a meeting, "the way he calculates people's worth when they're not watching." Eliza had noticed too, but challenging him without proof seemed petty. She let it go, a mistake that would cost them months of tension. Cross's true nature emerged slowly. He recruited newer homesteaders into a leadership council that excluded the original families. He talked about progress while undermining anyone who questioned him. When Ruth challenged his vague community projects, he dismissed her as too old-fashioned to understand modern organization. "He's trying to take over what we built," Way said flatly. The breaking point came when a young man named Peter Walsh brought Daniel evidence of embezzlement. Cross had been stealing from community funds, small amounts that grew bolder as his confidence increased. "Why come forward now?" Daniel asked. "Because my sister just joined. She looks at Vernon the way I used to, like he's saving us. And I realized if I don't stop this, he'll destroy everything you fought for." They exposed Cross at a community meeting. Faced with documented theft, his empire crumbled in a single evening. The community voted to expel him, and he left threatening to start his own settlement, do things the right way. "He'll fail," Ruth predicted. "Men like that always do. Good at building, terrible at maintaining, because maintenance requires humility." But the incident left scars. Trust had been damaged, easy cooperation replaced by formal structures and written rules. Necessary, but symptomatic of lost innocence. "We can't go back to how it was," Margaret said sadly. "No," Eliza agreed, "but we can build something better, something that protects against both external threats and internal corruption." They spent a year creating proper governance, councils with term limits, clear rules about funds and decisions, structures that could outlast individual personalities. Exhausting, tedious work that mattered more than dramatic fights. Caroline was 8, asking questions that cut to the heart of everything. Why did Mr. Cross steal from people who trusted him? Because he confused his own ambition with the community's good. Started believing what he wanted must be what everyone needed. How do you stop that? You build systems that make it harder, and you stay vigilant. The moment you stop paying attention, someone like Cross steps in to make decisions for you. That sounds exhausting, Eliza laughed. It is, but it's the price of freedom. The bakery in Red Hollow thrived, funding Daniel's expanding legal practice. They won significant cases beyond the homestead fight, stopping railroads from seizing land, forcing mining companies to pay damages, challenging corrupt officials. Not every case succeeded, but each fight mattered. We're changing things, Daniel said. Slowly, but changing them. Is it enough? Eliza asked. It's never enough, but it's better than it was. Better than it was became her metric for success. Not perfection, but measurable improvement. Rowan's health began failing in his late 50s. The slow accumulation of years lived hard. His joints ached, breathing grew labored. Old injuries caused new problems. A fall while checking trap lines left him with a broken leg that healed poorly. You need to rest, Eliza told him. I'm not an old man yet. You're 57 and limping. Accept help for once. I'm not good at needing people. I noticed. Took me a year to get you to admit feelings, another to propose, and apparently a broken leg to accept help. You're a slow learner. That got a laugh. Caroline, now 13, took over many of Rowan's tasks with competence that was both impressive and heartbreaking. The territorial movement towards statehood brought new battles. Daniel threw himself into constitutional debates, fighting for property rights protections and limits on corporate power. They won some provisions, lost others. The final constitution wasn't everything he'd hoped for, but it was better than before. It's a foundation, he wrote, something to build on. Colorado became a state the summer Caroline turned 15. The homesteader community celebrated, knowing their fights had helped shape the founding documents. Red Hollow held celebrations too, and Eliza felt genuinely welcome for the first time in years. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that she'd become someone who mattered. "You've come full circle," Catherine observed, "from this town's biggest shame to one of its proudest achievements." "I don't belong to this town. I never did." "Maybe not. But you belong to the story of what it can become." Rowan died on a winter morning 3 years later, peacefully in his sleep. He was 60, too young, except remembering how he'd lived made it seem almost inevitable. They'd burned bright together instead of long. They buried him in the meadow where they'd married, where so much of their life had unfolded. The entire community attended, over 200 people honoring a man who'd helped create something bigger than himself. "He gave me my life back," Eliza said at the service, "literally and figuratively. He taught me strength I didn't know I had, gave me choices when I had none. What we built together, the community, the proof that ordinary people can stand against power, that lives on. That's his legacy." The grief was enormous. She'd forgotten how dying hurt the living, but she'd survived loss before. She'd do it again. Caroline was 17, old enough for adult responsibilities, but still needing guidance. Together, they maintained the homestead through that terrible winter, supporting each other while honoring Rowan through continued work. "He wouldn't want us to stop," Caroline said. "Wouldn't want us to quit just because he did. No, he'd want us to keep fighting." The cooperative reached its 10th anniversary the year after Rowan died. So much had changed, so many original fighters gone, but the community remained stronger than any individual. "We built something that lasts," Way said. "That's rare." "It lasts because we structured it to last," Eliza corrected. "Because we learned from Hale and Cross. Because we made it harder for any one person to destroy what took all of us to create." Caroline at 18 was becoming her own person, not just her parents' daughter, but someone distinct. She'd inherited Eliza's protectiveness and Rowan's connection to land. The combination made her formidable. "What are you going to do with your life?" Eliza asked. "Keep fighting, same as you. There's always another battle." "That's not a life plan. Maybe fighting is my life plan. Maybe I want to matter the way you and Dad mattered." Eliza recognized herself in those words. "Just promise me something. Remember, it's okay to rest sometimes, to build a life alongside the fighting. I nearly forgot that. Learn it faster." Red Hollow made Eliza an official honor the following spring, naming the town square Crow Square, with a plaque about her family's contributions. It was well-intentioned but strange, turning tragedy into celebration. The ceremony was uncomfortable but brief. The mayor gave a speech about resilience. Catherine laid flowers. Sykes's widow apologized publicly for her husband's role. "We failed you," she said. "This doesn't undo that, but it acknowledges it, and it reminds future generations that shame belongs to those who stood by, not those who suffered." Eliza accepted it with grace. It didn't heal wounds, but it was better than silence. Sarah's legal practice had grown, 3 lawyers now, handling cases across Colorado. They lost more than they won, but every fight mattered. "I remember sitting in your cabin as a 6-year-old, watching my parents decide whether to run or fight," Sarah said. "You standing up and saying we'd fight together changed my life, made me believe change was possible. Now I'm trying to do the same for others." Victor Hale died that year, still wealthy but diminished. His obituary mentioned both success and legal troubles. "He lost in the end," Caroline said. "No," Eliza corrected. "He didn't win everything, but he didn't lose completely. We won our specific fight, but the larger fight against people like him continues. Hale was a symptom, not the disease." "So we keep fighting." "We keep fighting." Eliza was 42, solidly middle-aged and feeling it. But still here, still fighting, still building. Caroline married that fall. A young lawyer named Michael Torres. The wedding was in the meadow with Ruth officiating again. "I've done this 4 times now," Ruth said. "Every time I think I'm too old, someone drags me back." Watching Caroline marry, Eliza felt time's passage acutely. Her baby was a woman making her own choices. The cycle continued. Daniel died peacefully 2 years later. Sarah renamed the practice Hirsch and Vance, attorneys for the people. They deserve to be remembered together. Different kinds of fighters, but fighting for the same things. Eliza stepped back from legal work as she approached 50, focusing on teaching the next generation. She gave lectures about their history, about why things were structured the way they were. "You're becoming a living legend," Margaret teased. "I didn't change everything. I helped change some things, with dozens of others. The legend version is cleaner than reality." Caroline and Michael had a daughter they named Margaret. Watching Eliza hold her granddaughter, Margaret started crying. "You made it, against all odds. You survived and built a life, and now there's another generation. That's victory." And maybe it was. Not courtroom triumph, but this, continuity, family, going on. Ruth died when Eliza was 53, the last of the original 7 besides Eliza. They buried her in the mountains she'd loved, over 300 people attending. "The original fighters are almost gone," Caroline observed, "and a community that carries forward what we fought for. That's what matters." Wei died the following winter. That left Eliza as sole survivor of the original 7, the only one who'd stood on that platform and lived through everything after. Being last was strange. People looked at her differently, not as a fighter, but as a monument, a living connection to founding events. "I'm not a saint," she told Caroline, "just someone who refused to quit." That's exactly what makes you worth honoring. Her 60th birthday brought celebrations across the cooperative. A reporter asked what she'd learned. That powerlessness is a choice. That systems only seem unchangeable until people change them. That individual fights matter even when they fail. That justice is a direction you move in, not a destination. And that ordinary people doing extraordinary things together can reshape the world. Any regrets? Hundreds. But none about the fighting itself. Regret is just information about what to do differently next time. What would you tell your younger self on that auction platform? That rock bottom is a beginning, not an end. That the worst day of your life can lead to the best life you never imagined. That strength you don't know you have is still strength. And that when someone with nothing left to lose chooses to fight, everything changes. Eliza lived another 8 years, long enough to see Caroline become formidable, to watch granddaughter Margaret grow fierce and bright, to know what they'd built would outlast her. She died peacefully at 68 in the cabin she'd shared with Rowan. Caroline found her in the morning, looking peaceful in death. They buried her beside Rowan. Over 1,000 people attended. The cooperative had grown beyond anything imaginable, spreading across states, a network embodying everything she'd fought for. "She changed the world," Caroline said, holding baby Margaret. Not single-handedly, she'd hate that, but through tireless work with others. She proved the powerless don't have to stay powerless. She started with nothing but rage and resilience and built an empire of mutual aid that will outlast us all. But years later, when people told Eliza's story, they focused on dramatic parts. The platform, Hale, the courtroom. They turned her into legend. But the real story was messier, about a woman who'd been broken and chose to rebuild, who fought constantly through defeat and victory, who understood changing the world meant exhausting, unglamorous work of building systems and teaching people and showing up daily, who proved that when someone with nothing left to lose refuses to accept powerlessness, when they choose to fight despite every reason to quit, they can reshape not just their life, but the world. That was the lesson. Not that one person could change everything, but that one person fighting could inspire others, creating ripples that became waves that became movements. Red Hollow eventually erected a statue in Crow Square, Eliza with rifle and law books, looking toward mountains. The inscription read, "She stood on this spot at her lowest moment and chose to rise. What will you choose?" But the real memorial wasn't bronze. It was hundreds of communities built on principles she'd helped establish. Thousands who fought because her story showed it was possible. Slow progress toward a world where auction platforms were relics instead of reality. That was the legacy. Not a statue, but proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to quit. When they understood rock bottom was just another place to build a foundation. When they chose to fight. And when someone with nothing left to lose makes that choice, everything changes.